Chapter 1. This was a gloomy and terrifying magic swamp. The fog was thick and heavy. Even during the day, the bright sunlight could not penetrate the low clouds and gloomy fog, allowing one to feel the warmth of the human world. Filthy and muddy puddles could be seen everywhere. There was not much water, but there were many strange creatures living in them. Whenever a stranger intruded, this silent and desolate place would instantly become a paradise for scavenging and bloodthirsty creatures. Vampiric vines, scavenging crows, swamp crocodiles, an ugly hag who looked like a drowned person. Each of them was a terrifying monster that passing merchants avoided. However, in the center of this swamp, where the living could not step foot, stood a terrifying tower that was over 100 meters tall. It was a stone tower. Its base was made of thick and dense green radiant stones. Whenever night fell, the entire tower would emit a cold and quiet radiant fluorescence, especially favored by ghosts and vengeful spirits. Perhaps due to the lack of necessary maintenance and care, the entire bottom of the tower was entangled by madly growing demonic vines, covered with wooden spikes that were full of metallic luster. If a normal person was entangled by these demonic vines, their blood would be sucked dry in no time, and they would become a member of the thick white bones at the root of the vines. The sky had just darkened, and candles were lit in the tower. The dim candlelight shone through the narrow window. Not only did it not bring any warmth, but it also sent a chill down one's spine. Grimm, who had just celebrated his 15th birthday, sat in front of a shabby wooden table. A thick spell book was open in front of him, and he was silently copying it. Although it had been 2 years since he came to this new world, the discomfort in his soul still gave him a headache from time to time. While he was in a trance, the scenes that happened on Earth kept flashing in front of his eyes. The tip of his pen could not help but pause, leaving a large blob of ink on the simple parchment. Damn it, I failed again. Grimm frowned, and could not help but clench his fists, wanting to shout a few times in anger. But after enduring for a long time, he finally suppressed his anger. This was no longer the Earth he was familiar with, and this body used to belong to a wizard apprentice called Grimm. To be honest, he was just a transmigrator who took over Grimm's body the moment he died. Transmigrating empty-handed from a low-magic Earth to a high-magic world where monsters ran rampant and wizards ruled. The difficult process of adapting made Li Sun want to die. Fortunately, after Li Sun had fused with the memory fragments left behind by this body, he now had the basic ability to speak and write. Otherwise, just the strange pronunciation of this world's completely unconventional tadpole-shaped characters would have tortured him half to death. But even so, the headache that appeared from time to time still deeply troubled him. Here, he did not dare to reveal his true identity. He could only use Grimm's name and struggle to survive in this wizard tower. As an acolyte under Grandmaster Anderson, this glorious identity was already worthy of the envy of most people. But only the people who lived in the tower knew that it wasn't an honor, but it was the most terrifying torture in the world. As a wizard apprentice, their basic job was to diligently take care of the great Master Anderson's daily life, clean up the witchcraft experiment equipment, keep the tower clean, take care of the magical animals and plants outside the tower, and become Master Anderson's experimental subjects. Although this was not common, when the convoy of slaves or death row prisoners arrived a few days late, Master Anderson, who lacked experimental subjects, would get annoyed and order an apprentice to be his temporary lab rat. It was said that Mary from Annie County next door had the honor of becoming Master Anderson's witchcraft experiment collaborator last month. Although she did not die in the witchcraft experiment, her body was seriously polluted and had some terrible changes. Ever since she came out of the laboratory, she had put on a thick robe and hid in her room every day, never coming out again. Many sorcerer apprentices were whispering that Mary might have died in the room, but Grimm knew that Mary was still alive. Every night when it was quiet, he could hear the painful and suppressed moans in the next room, as well as the terrible sound of sharp claws and teeth scraping against the rock wall. For this reason, every night when it was quiet, he would sneak the food he brought back into the room next door. Although Grimm's life was precarious, out of a trace of compassion in his nature, he was still willing to do something more humane within his ability. Today's migraine came at the wrong time. It just had to happen when he was copying a book. What made him even more unlucky was that he had wasted a piece of parchment. Don't underestimate this crumpled piece of parchment. It was worth 2 silver coins. In this magical world, the most commonly used currency was the wizard gold coin. 1 wizard gold coin could be exchanged for 10 silver coins, and 1 silver coin could be exchanged for 10 copper coins. 5 copper coins were enough to feed a commoner for a day. So in this way, a seemingly ordinary piece of parchment could be regarded as a huge sum of money for the commoners. But here, it was just a piece of trash that could be casually thrown away by wizard apprentices. Nothing was free in the wizard tower. Every day, Grimm had to earn his food and drink, including the cost of learning witchcraft. The only way to earn money was to go out of the wizard tower and feed the ferocious magical creatures, take care of the creepy magical plants, pick some witchcraft materials designated by the wizards, and clean up some dangerous witchcraft areas in the tower. When doing these jobs, they would wear the witchcraft amulets made by the wizards themselves, which could prevent them from triggering the witchcraft circles around the tower. But in this mysterious and strange world, no job could be absolutely safe. Every month or two, there would always be a few unlucky people who would be swallowed by the magical plants and animals while taking care of them, or die from the witchcraft radiation while cleaning a witchcraft area. Therefore, most of the time, the relatively leisurely and comfortable jobs within the tower were monopolized by those senior sorcerer apprentices. The rest of the weaker sorcerer apprentices could only choose the more dangerous jobs in order to earn money and knowledge points to continue their sorcery studies. Of course, money was used to buy some biological supplies, and knowledge points were a value system that was specially designed by wizards to buy knowledge. In the library inside the tower, every witchcraft book was clearly marked with different knowledge points. Borrowing books only accepted knowledge points, not money. Only by working hard to earn knowledge points could the apprentices borrow the books they needed for a short period of time. And this amount of time was definitely not enough for the apprentices to understand all the knowledge in the books, so most of the apprentices would develop the habit of copying books. Every time they borrowed a witchcraft book, the apprentices would strive to copy the knowledge they needed in the shortest time possible, so that they could continue to study in the future. And copying could not be done without ink and parchment paper, but these were not free. They needed money to buy. Of course, if a wizard apprentice had a good family, he could use a lot of money to exchange for knowledge points. The conversion ratio between them was 1 knowledge point equals 100 gold coins. For example, the book Grimm borrowed today, General Handbook of Magical Creatures, needed 3 knowledge points and could only be borrowed for half a day. Based on Grimm's copying speed, he would need to borrow the book at least 3 times before he could finish the entire book. This would add up to 9 knowledge points, and Grimm would need to go out of the tower for 2 weeks to earn these 9 knowledge points. Therefore, it was not a pity that he had wasted a piece of parchment paper because of his migraine, but it was a pity that he had wasted 2 hours of copying time. This was the main reason why he was so angry. While Grimm was trying his best to suppress his anger and prevent it from affecting his copying, a familiar beep sounded in his mind. Beep. Biological energy reached the required level. Biological support chip number ZXJ9521 activating. Grimm cried out in surprise. Biological support chip. Once upon a time, during the difficult times when he first came to this world, Grimm had fantasized more than once that he could become a powerful god who could travel to another world with a divine artifact. He punched the Nansha nursing home, kicked the North Sea kindergarten, knocked down everything under a meter, and stomped his feet in the morgue. Stand up if you're not satisfied. Nobody dared to breathe. It was a pity that this damned AI chip, which had already fused with him, only gave him occasional migraines. There was no other movement. Who would have thought that it would finally activate today? After the noisy debugging sounds faded, a beautiful androgynous female voice sounded in Grimm's mind. Detected host, data modeling in progress. Please wait. It could still transform into its current body. This was something worth looking forward to. After all, he was currently in a high magic world. The plane was filled with a mysterious substance called elemental particles. These elemental particles were divided into earth, fire, water, wind, light, and dark based on the basic elements of the plane. Chapter 2. It was a gloomy and terrifying magic swamp. The fog was thick and heavy. Even during the day, the bright sunlight could not penetrate the low clouds and gloomy fog, making this place feel a trace of warmth from the human world. Filthy and muddy puddles could be seen everywhere. There was not much water, but there were many strange creatures living in them. Whenever a stranger intruded, this silent and desolate place would instantly become a paradise for scavenging and bloodthirsty creatures. Vampiric vines carrying crows, swamp crocodiles, an ugly hag who looked like drowned people. Each of them was a terrifying monster that merchants avoided. However, in the middle of this swamp where no living person could step foot, there was a terrifying tower that was over 100 meters tall. It was a stone tower. Its base was made of thick and dense green radiant stones. Whenever night fell, the whole tower would emit a cold and quiet radiant fluorescence, which was especially favored by ghosts and vengeful spirits. Perhaps due to the lack of maintenance, the bottom of the tower was entangled by crazily growing magic vines, which were full of wooden spikes with a metallic luster. If a normal person was entangled by these magic vines, their blood would be sucked dry in no time, and they would become a member of the thick white bones at the root of the vines. As the sky darkened, candles were lit in the tower. The dim candlelight shone through the narrow window. Not only did it not bring any warmth, but it also made people feel a chill in their hearts. Grimm, who had just celebrated his 15th birthday, sat in front of a shabby wooden table. A thick magic book was opened in front of him, and he was silently copying it. Although it had been 2 years since he came to this new world, the discomfort in his soul still gave him a headache from time to time. While he was in a trance, the scenes that happened on Earth kept flashing in front of his eyes. The tip of his pen could not help but pause, leaving a big blob of ink on the simple parchment. Damn it, I failed again. Grimm frowned and could not help but clench his fists, wanting to shout a few times in anger. However, after enduring for a long time, he finally suppressed his anger. This was no longer the Earth he was familiar with, and this body once belonged to a wizard apprentice called Grimm. To be honest, he was just a transmigrator who took over Grimm's life the moment he died. Traveling empty-handed from a low-magic Earth to a high-magic world ruled by wizards and monsters, this difficult adaptation process made Li Sun feel so much pain that he wanted to die. Fortunately, after Li Sun had fused with the memory fragments left behind by this body, he now had the basic ability to speak and write. Otherwise, just the strange pronunciation of this world's completely unconventional tadpole-like characters would have tortured him half to death. But even so, the occasional headache still deeply troubled him. Here, he didn't dare to reveal his true identity. He could only use Grimm's name and struggle to survive in the Wizard Tower. As an acolyte under Grandmaster Anderson, this glorious identity was already worthy of the envy of most people. However, only the people living in the Wizard Tower knew that this was not a kind of glory, but the most terrible torture in the world. As a wizard's acolyte, their basic job was to diligently take care of the great Grandmaster Anderson's daily life, clean up the witchcraft experiment equipment, keep the tower clean, take care of the magical animals and plants outside the tower, and become Anderson's experimental subjects. Although this was not common, when the caravan of slaves or prisoners arrived a few days late, Anderson, who lacked experimental subjects, would get annoyed and order an acolyte to be his temporary lab rat. It was said that Mary from Antwerp had the honor of becoming Anderson's witchcraft experiment collaborator last month. Although she did not die in the witchcraft experiment, her body was seriously polluted and had undergone some terrible changes. Ever since she came out of the laboratory, she had put on a thick robe and hid in her room every day, never coming out again. Many sorcerer apprentices were whispering that Mary might have died in the room, but Grimm knew that Mary was still alive. Every night when it was quiet, he could hear the painful and suppressed moans in the room next door, as well as the terrible sound of sharp claws and teeth scraping against the rock wall. Because of this, every night when it was quiet, he would secretly throw the food he brought back into the room next door. Although Grimm's life was also precarious, out of a trace of compassion in his nature, he was still willing to do something more humane within his ability. Today's migraine came at the wrong time. It just had to happen when he was copying a book. What made him even more unlucky was that he wasted a piece of parchment. Don't underestimate this crumpled piece of parchment. Its basic value was 2 silver coins. In this magical world, the most commonly used currency was the wizard gold coin. 1 wizard gold coin could be exchanged for 10 silver coins, and 1 silver coin could be exchanged for 10 copper coins. 5 copper coins could feed a commoner for a day. So in this way, a seemingly ordinary piece of parchment could be considered a huge sum of money for the commoners. But here, it was just trash that acolytes could casually throw away. In the wizard tower, nothing was free. Grimm had to earn his daily food and drink, as well as the cost of learning witchcraft. The only way to earn money was to go out of the wizard tower and feed the ferocious magical creatures, take care of the creepy magical plants, pick some witchcraft materials designated by the wizards, and clean up some dangerous witchcraft areas in the wizard tower. When doing these jobs, they would wear magic amulets made by the wizards, which could prevent them from triggering the witchcraft circles around the wizard tower. But in this mysterious and strange world, no job could be absolutely safe. Every month or two, there would always be a few unlucky people who would be swallowed by magical plants or animals while taking care of them, or they would die in the witchcraft radiation while cleaning a certain witchcraft area. So most of the time, the relatively easy jobs in the wizard tower were monopolized by the veteran acolytes. The rest of the week, acolytes could only choose the more dangerous jobs in order to earn money and knowledge points to continue learning witchcraft. Of course, money was used to buy some biological supplies, while knowledge points were a value system specially designed by the wizards to buy knowledge. In a library inside the wizard tower, every witchcraft book was clearly marked with different knowledge points. Borrowing books only accepted knowledge points, not money. Acolytes had to work hard to earn knowledge points in order to borrow the books they needed for a short period of time. But this amount of time was definitely not enough for acolytes to understand all the knowledge in the books, so most acolytes would develop the habit of copying books. Every time they borrowed a witchcraft book, acolytes would try to copy the knowledge they needed in the shortest time possible so that they could continue to study in the future. Ink and parchment were indispensable for copying, but they were not free. They needed money to buy them. Of course, if an acolyte had a good family, he could use a lot of money to exchange for knowledge points. The conversion ratio between them was 1 knowledge point equals 100 gold coins. For example, the book Grimm borrowed today, General Handbook of Magical Creatures, required 3 knowledge points, and he could only borrow it for half a day. With Grimm's copying speed, if he wanted to completely copy the book, he would need to borrow it at least 3 times. This would add up to 9 knowledge points, and Grimm would need to go out of the wizard tower for 2 consecutive weeks to earn these 9 knowledge points. Therefore, it was not a pity that he wasted a piece of parchment because of his migraine, but it was a pity that he wasted 2 hours of copying time. This was the main reason why he was so angry. Just as Grimm was trying to use all his strength to suppress his anger and not let it affect his copying, a familiar beep suddenly rang in his mind. Beep. Biological energy reached the required level. Biological support chip number ZXJ9521 activating. Grimm cried out in surprise. Biological support chip. Once upon a time, during the difficult times when he first came to this world, Grimm had fantasized more than once that he could become a powerful god who could travel to another world with a divine artifact. He punched the Nansha nursing home, kicked the North Sea kindergarten, knocked down everything under a meter, and stomped his feet in the morgue. Stand up if you don't accept this. It was a pity that this damned AI chip, which had already fused with him, only gave him occasional migraines. There was no other movement. Unexpectedly, it was finally activated today. After the noisy debugging sounds faded, a beautiful androgynous female voice echoed in Grimm's mind. Detected host, data modeling in progress. Please wait. It could still transform into its current body. This was something worth looking forward to. After all, he was currently in a high magic world. The plane was filled with magical substances called elemental particles. These elemental particles were divided into earth, fire, water, wind, light, and dark based on the basic elements of the plane. Chapter 3. After a long wait, the biochip finally completed its first self-examination with great difficulty. Soon, Grimm's basic attributes were projected into his mind. Name: Grimm race. Human attributes: Strength 4, Agility 4, Constitution 3, Spirit 8, Alignment. Neutral profession: Wizard apprentice, beginner. HP profession experience status. Healthy profession skills: Scroll transcription, spell reading, personal skills. Burning hand in their world. Every normal human was born with some basic physical attributes. After many generations of wizards, these attributes were divided into 4 categories: strength, constitution, agility, and spirit. Basically, all wizard advancement revolved around these 4 basic attributes. The strength attribute quantified a character's muscles and sturdiness. This attribute was especially important for close combat wizards. The strength attribute affected the basic damage of close combat weapons, as well as the accuracy of close combat attacks. For a normal person, having 3 to 5 strength was normal, and 5 strength was already considered a strong adult. The agility attribute quantified hand-eye coordination, flexibility, reflexes, and balance. This attribute was very important for warriors who usually wore light or medium armor, thieves who wore leather armor, and anyone who wanted to become an excellent archer. Constitution represented the character's health and endurance. Constitution could increase the character's vitality, so it was very important for all professions. Toughness check, used to resist poison and similar threats. Focus check. Focus was a very important skill for spellcasters, and it used Constitution as the key attribute. A human's Constitution was at least 1, and any human with less than 1 would die. Spirit determined the character's ability to learn and reason. This attribute was very important for wizards because it determined the number of spells a wizard could cast, the difficulty of resisting spells, and the power of spells. Animals had 1 or 2 spirit, and humans had at least 3 spirit. If a normal person wanted to become a wizard, they had to have at least 21 spirit. Based on how useful these attributes were to the wizard profession, the most important one to Grimm was the spiritual force attribute. As long as Grimm's power of the will reached 21 points, he would be able to become an official wizard in a single bound. The only way to increase his spirit was to constantly meditate, read books on witchcraft, or read the notes and experiences of old wizards. But these were things that could never be achieved. In this cold and cruel sorcerer world, knowledge represented power, and to obtain power, one had to pay a high price. Why did so many sorcerer apprentices stay here despite knowing that the wizard tower was full of dangers? This was because all the knowledge and resources could only be obtained here. After stepping out of the wizard tower, it would be difficult to find such a systematic inheritance of witchcraft knowledge and experience in human society, even if one had the wealth to rival a country. In the terrifying sorcerer world, all extraordinary spell-casting techniques and precious spell knowledge were monopolized by the sorcerer community. Ordinary mortals had no chance of coming into contact with them. Therefore, knowledge and resources became the 2 wings that wizards needed to pursue their dreams. Only by grasping these 2 things could a magus have a bright future. After looking at the basic attributes, Grimm shifted his attention to the skill window. Grimm's profession skills included scroll scribing and spell reading. This was also the most basic profession skill for sorcerer apprentices. One allowed the apprentices to scribble down the witchcraft knowledge they needed, and the other was the basics of reading books on witchcraft. Without the spell reading skill, ordinary people would be confused by the extraordinary words in the books when they came into contact with witchcraft books, causing them to do unimaginable things. Only sorcerer apprentices who had undergone rigorous mental training could overcome this effect and truly read the witchcraft knowledge stored in the books. In the skill window, there was only one Burning Hand, which was the only attack spell that Grimm had mastered in the 6 years he had been a sorcerer apprentice. Burning Hand could attach an elemental flame to his palm, turning anyone who dared to touch his palm into a roasted pig. There was nothing he could do about it. Grimm was just a wizard apprentice, and it was impossible for him to cast a complete spell. He could only choose the most suitable basic particles based on his elemental affinity and play with elements that looked cool but were actually very ordinary. The basic particle that Grimm had the highest affinity with was, of course, the fire element. This kind of talent was not very good in the Swamp Tower. As everyone knew, Anderson's elemental affinity was the dark and wind elements, which was also known as the dark and wind elements. Grimm's path was not the same as his mentor, so it would be much more difficult to get guidance from him. Most of the time, he could only rely on himself to slowly explore. This problem had been bothering Grimm in the past. However, with the activation of the biochip, Grimm believed that he would be able to find a suitable path for himself in the future. As for the profession experience, Grimm had a preliminary understanding of it after looking through the biochip's relevant information. The biochip sorted out Grimm's past memories and knowledge and found out 2 prerequisites for a sorcerer to advance. First, the sorcerer's spiritual force had to reach a certain standard. For example, Grimm's spiritual force was currently 8 points, which meant that he was far smarter than ordinary people. However, he was still 13 points away from the 21 points required to advance to an official sorcerer. However, this could be improved by reading a lot of books on witchcraft. It was not something that could be rushed. Second, one's own knowledge had to reach a certain standard. This also meant that after Grimm increased his spiritual force to 21 points, he would need to increase his current profession experience to the max before he could advance. He could not do without either. There were many ways to obtain experience points. For example, copying scrolls, reading spells, practicing casting, crafting wands, analyzing magic items. In short, the accumulation of any knowledge related to mysticism would give Grimm a certain amount of profession experience points. This sounded easy, but it was not easy. Only by succeeding could he obtain experience points. Only when Grimm understood a book on witchcraft could he truly obtain world feedback. Otherwise, simply reading it in one breath would be completely useless. Therefore, even with the help of the biochip, Grimm still had to put in a lot of effort. Just as Grimm was lost in his reverie, footsteps came from the corridor outside the house. "Grimm, come out quickly. It's time for us to carry out the mission." A rough voice sounded, followed by a heavy hammering sound on the wooden door. It was Tony, a wizard apprentice who had the same status as Grimm. Low-level apprentices like them had to patrol the surroundings of the Swamp Tower every 7 days and harvest some suitable witchcraft materials. This was also one of the daily tasks set by the master of the tower for apprentices to carry out. Grimm nodded and simply tidied up the room. He took a black cloak from the wall and put it on, then opened the door and walked out. Tony had broad shoulders and a strong body. His face was ferocious, and his long hair was messy. He looked more like a barbarian. It was said that he came from a country in the Green Highlands, and the people there did indeed have a trace of barbarian blood. After the two met, they did not exchange any unnecessary words. They just nodded at each other and walked along the dark corridor towards the staircase. Even though it was daytime, the two of them didn't see many acolytes around. Although there were more than 50 official apprentices in the Swamp Tower, most of the time, apprentices were either busy with their own witchcraft training or preparing for all kinds of strange witchcraft experiments. Very few of them would wander around in public. This was one of the main reasons why the Swamp Tower was usually quiet. After passing through the dark corridor, they followed the spiral stone staircase down to the hall on the first floor. The people here were a little more lively because it was the living area of apprentices. Most of them were between 8 to 14 years old, and there were about 20 of them. These little guys from far away all came here with the dream of becoming great wizards, but they did not know how dangerous and scary the path of becoming a wizard was. They did not know what was waiting for them in the future. In fact, there was a strict hierarchy among the apprentices of the tower. Generally speaking, most of the children here had a mind power between 3 to 5, so they were not real apprentices yet. They could only be called apprentices. Apprentices completed their language and writing learning here. After passing the meditation, they could feel their elemental affinity and successfully gather the elemental particles. Only then could they climb to the second floor and become an official apprentice. Those who couldn't meet the requirements would be eliminated. As for assisting these little fellows to complete their meditation, teaching them language and writing, and instilling them with the basic rules of the sorcerer world. Of course, these low-level jobs could not be done by the great sorcerers, so they became the official sorcerer apprentice's daily routine in the tower. However, such an easy daily task would never fall on Grimm's head. After greeting Valance, who was teaching the apprentice's language class, the two ignored the eager and fiery eyes of these little guys. They went straight through the hall and came in front of a closed stone door. Tony put his right hand on the stone door and said in a low voice, "Kirim Ada." Chapter 4. It was a gloomy and terrifying magic swamp. Even though it was daytime, the warm sunlight could not penetrate through the thick fog, so the light here was rather dim. The background color of the environment was rather gloomy and yellow. After staying in such an environment for a long time, even a person's personality would become gloomy. After the stone door slowly closed behind them, Tony pulled up his hood and said coldly, "I'm going over there." Without waiting for Grimm's reply, Tony turned around and stepped onto the narrow path on the left that was paved with small white stones. After Tony's sturdy figure disappeared in the fog, Grimm pulled up his hood and turned around to walk on the small path on the right. As he walked, he said softly, "Show me Tony's detection data." In the next second, the biochip's detection report on Tony appeared in his mind. Name: Tony Attribute. Strength 7, Agility 3, Vitality 8, Spiritual Power 6. Grimm curled his lips in surprise. With such a constitution, why didn't he change his profession and become a barbarian warrior? Tony's strength and vitality were actually twice his own, which meant that if Grimm fought him in close combat, he might not even be able to withstand a single punch. However, as a wizard apprentice, Tony's spiritual power was only 6 points, which was 2 points lower than Grimm's. No amount of strength or vitality could make up for this advantage. This meant that Tony was planning to develop into a close combat wizard, using all kinds of potions to strengthen his body and using spells to support his close combat abilities was probably the only path he could choose. The biochip was able to detect such precise data from the target's movements and behavior after interacting with them for a short period of time. This undoubtedly allowed Grimm to have more initiative in his interactions with others, and he could also avoid unnecessary risks. This was undoubtedly what Grimm cared about the most. However, this kind of detection method was probably useless against real magi. The bodies of official magi were always radiating strong elemental waves. This was an instinctive reaction after they condensed a large amount of energy, and it was also a way to prevent others from detecting their true condition. Under the interference of the powerful energy radiation, it was unknown how much valuable information the biochip could obtain from them. Even Grimm wasn't sure if they could detect the existence of the biochip, so he had to be extremely careful when using the biochip in the tower. The gravel path in front of him continued to stretch in the fog, and on both sides of the path were strange plants of varying heights. Short and thick conical tree trunks, closed leaves that curled up together, hanging vines that hung in 2s and 3s, mysterious flowers with brightly colored petals that were as big as wash basins, and a damp and dirty quagmire. This scene looked very ordinary, but Grimm knew that he could not step out of the gravel path. Almost none of the animals and plants that could survive in the magic swamp were docile and kind. They were all terrifying monsters that would devour people without spitting out their bones. Those bashful-looking low trees were terrifying killer trees. Once you got close to them, their curled-up leaves would suddenly stretch out and hug you in their arms. At this time, the hanging vines would wrap around you and stab your body with countless sharp tentacles, making you feel like your life was slipping away as you lost a drop of blood. After your blood was sucked dry, The remaining flesh and bones became the best fertilizer for the killer trees. If you were lucky enough to dig up the dark red soil at the foot of the killer trees, you would definitely find dense white bones, human bones, and beast bones. These were the only evidence left behind by the prey they had hunted. The swamp tower kept these monsters for two reasons. One was to prevent outsiders from entering, and the other was to harvest some special witchcraft materials. The rhizome of the killer tree and the blood sacs of the blood-sucking vines were good nourishment. For magi with weak constitutions, they were beneficial supplements. Every once in a while, wizard apprentices would risk being attacked by the magical plants to harvest materials. This was a dangerous mission with a high mortality rate. Perhaps it was because they sensed Grimm's flesh aura. The previously lifeless swamp suddenly became lively. The monsters that were beyond Grimm's senses and sight were all wriggling their bodies and branches, slowly approaching the gravel path. However, when Grimm's gaze swept past them, they would once again freeze, as if they had never moved in the first place. Grimm didn't seem to care about the little tricks of the magical plant. No matter how crazy and brutal they were, they did not dare to cross the simple gravel path beneath their feet. It was as if there was something there that they were afraid of. Search the database and record the magical plants in front of me. Mission activation failed. Host database has been damaged. Unable to match species. Activating elemental vision. Rebuilding model. Following a series of chip prompts, the image projected on his retina shook for a moment, and then a huge amount of data flowed down like a waterfall from the top, using a gorgeous fluorescent light to render every object in his field of vision into a multicolored scene. Elemental vision? Was this a special ability that the AI chip had fused with his current body's abilities? The green base indicated that these monsters were plants, while the red, yellow, blue, and purple colors indicated where their energy was concentrated. Apart from that, the ever-changing environmental humidity, temperature, wind speed, concentration of toxic particles, distribution and flow of elemental particles. All the data that the AI chip could detect were displayed in the form of dynamic images in front of him. Grimm furrowed his brows. This colorful and overly complex visual projection had seriously affected his normal vision. How is he going to see things in the future? Remove the ineffective color spectrum. Remove the diffuse fluorescence. Focus elemental vision on the most common energy systems. As Grimm's orders were passed down, the dazzling lights gradually dimmed. Everything in his field of vision returned to their original state. However, with the powerful elemental vision of the AI chip, the edges of everything became translucent. Even the elemental particles in the air became faintly visible. In Grimm's eyes, the thick, white fog now looked like lumps, threads, and pieces of slow-moving water elemental particles. They were restrained by a mysterious force and could not disperse. They could only envelop this magical swamp for years. Grimm stood still, his eyes flickering under the shadow of his hood. He stared unblinkingly at the magic plant by the side of the road. With his new sense of sight, the other side of the man that was hidden under the disguise was finally revealed to Kieran. Under the wrinkled bark of the tree, there were many eerie and terrifying faces. These were the souls that the killer tree had forcefully bound. On the gray trunk of the killer tree, the edges of its curled leaves, and the tips of its needle-like thorns, Grimm could see green energy fluorescence. This should be the energy spectrum of the killer tree's paralyzing venom. Under Grimm's elemental vision, the vampiric vine attached to the killer tree looked like a terrifying red monster. Pure blood flowed under its twisted and wriggling green skin, and at the place where it was connected to the killer tree, inside the hollow tree cavity, fist-sized blood sacs were expanding and contracting rhythmically, looking very much like a human heart. Asterisk caw caw. Asterisk with a few ear-piercing screeches. A flock of carrion crows flew over and landed on a tree branch. They blinked their scarlet eyes and stared at Grimm. To be honest, being stared at by a group of ominous monsters made Grimm feel uncomfortable. Grimm did not dare to be careless when faced with these uninvited swamp monsters. Although the carrion ravens could not be considered as powerful magical beasts, their blood-red eyes also had a slight mind-loss ability. Previously, there had also been frightening examples of students being blinded by their pecks. Seeing the eagerness of the carrion crows, Grimm raised his right hand and softly chanted a spell that he was very familiar with. After 5 seconds of casting, a large amount of crimson magical flames ignited in Grimm's hand. The flames spouted and twisted. Grimm's entire right hand was wrapped in the magical flame, but it was not injured at all. Burning Hand. This was the only spell that Grimm had learned in the Wizard Tower for 6 years. With Grimm's current abilities, he could only extend the demonic flames of the Burning Hand to a distance of 5 steps. He was powerless to extend any further, so it could only be considered a close-range spell. The magical flame that reflected the thick fog in the surroundings burned fiercely. The powerful fire elemental wave finally made the monsters in the swamp realize that the human in front of them was not someone they could easily capture. The monsters that were slowly gathering around Grimm seemed to be greatly frightened. One by one, they ran away from the 2 sides of the path. The carrion crows cawed loudly and flew into the sky. After circling for a while, they disappeared into the depths of the fog. Grimm let out a long sigh and finally felt a little relieved. These monsters did not dare to set foot on this gravel path, but this did not stop them from using their own methods to trick or threaten apprentices to leave the path. If Grimm was frightened by the scene of them gathering around him and ran out of the path in a panic, it would be difficult to protect his life even with the protection spell. The soul and flesh of an apprentice were undoubtedly much more delicious than those of ordinary humans and beasts. Moreover, this did not violate the agreement between the monsters and the Wizard Tower. Therefore, every patrol outside the tower was a profound test of the apprentice's willpower. If the monsters found a loophole in the apprentice's mind, it would not end well for him. Record all the information of these monsters, Grimm said calmly. This. Recorded. Please name them. Killer Tree, Vampiric Vine, Carrion Crow. Chapter 5. Taking advantage of the fact that the monsters were stunned by the demonic flame in his hand, Grimm quickly walked out of the small path. He pushed aside the soil at the foot of a killer tree and used the demonic flame to force open the thick roots. Only then did he see the materials that he had to harvest today. Between the messy roots of the killer tree and the shining white human bones, there were thumb-sized rhizomes. Some were white, some were red, and some were purple. Grimm suppressed the annoyance in his heart and used his knife to pick 3 purple pearls. He carefully placed them in his waist pouch and quickly returned to the small path. He had no choice. This was one of the tasks that he had to complete. Otherwise, he would rather die than take a step out of the small path. Even though he had moved so quickly, the monsters that had just escaped had already gathered again. The vines on the killer tree where he had been squatting had already lowered their vines. If he had been slightly slower, it would have been difficult for him to escape without going through a massacre. Just now, he had used his elemental sight to find the one with the mature rhizomes. Normally, he would need to frequently enter and exit the small path to search for them. That way, the danger he was in would increase as he entered and exited the area. After walking along the small path for a few hundred meters, he left the living area of the killer trees. In front of him was a horrifying ghost tree that spanned across the gravel path. The vines that hung down from the tree were like living creatures, wriggling nonstop. Grimm pulled out the magic amulet that represented his identity from his neck and softly chanted the secret spell that every wizard apprentice must know. Muhantoria Shinro. When the secret spell was completed, a formless and mysterious force burst forth from the amulet that looked like a black cross and quickly engulfed every inch of the surrounding space. Grimm's mind quickly rang with an urgent alert. Abnormal force field detected. Chip's function is being interfered with. The Chip's voice became weaker and weaker. Finally, it became an ear-piercing noise and no longer moved. However, Grimm did not care. He raised a magic amulet high and strode forward. As he approached, the vines retreated and curled up, finally creating a desolate path for him. After patrolling the killer trees and vampiric vines territory, it was time to enter the baby monster's paradise. Grimm's heart was filled with unconcealable fear towards that place. After passing through the eerie ghost tree, they arrived at the Whispering Garden. Both sides of the path were filled with large and small barren flower beds and abandoned gardens, which were filled with gray and endless monsters. The unique climate and environment of the magic swamp made it a paradise for baby demons, banshees, and flower spirits. A large group of twisted monsters that only knew how to satisfy their own appetites gathered here. Every living being that broke into this place would eventually fall under their endless malicious infection and illusions, becoming fertilizer for the special plants that loved death and resentment. Groups of human-faced mushrooms clustered on both sides of the road. They held hands and sang cheerful songs, enthusiastically inviting Grimm to join them. This little thing looked like a small mushroom with hands and feet. It was famous because the markings on its canopy resembled a human face. Even if these mushrooms had hands and feet, they wouldn't reach the height of a human's calf. However, when they gathered together and jumped and laughed, Grimm could feel a deep chill spreading all over his body. Warning, warning, detected a special force field affecting the host. Please leave this area in time. Grimm kept stepping back. When he was a little further away from the mushrooms, the chill on his body began to fade. Although these mushrooms looked cute, they were real carnivorous monsters. They were so cruel that they wouldn't even let go of the souls of their prey. Their bodies were white mushrooms that had been contaminated with dense dark elements. Every single one of them had very weak hallucinogenic abilities, which was not enough to capture large creatures like humans. However, they were social creatures. When hundreds and thousands of mushrooms gathered together, they could create a mirage-like illusion field, causing the bewitched creatures to be immersed in it without knowing it. Therefore, when a group of mushrooms pounced on the victim and started feasting on them, the victim would still be immersed in some unknown fantasy space with a smile on his face. For official magi, these simple hallucinogenic mushrooms were good ingredients for magic potions. However, for an acolyte like Grimm, every time he patrolled this area, he would have to risk his life being lured to death by these little monsters. If Grimm could not resist the illusionary domain of the human-face mushrooms and was lured into the flower bed, the human-face mushrooms would be able to feast on him without violating the contract. Therefore, when faced with these sinister monsters that were laughing and gathering around him, Grimm grinned and took out an egg-sized round stone from his pouch. He threw it into the dense group of mushrooms. In the next moment, a light blue lightning flashed, and 5 mushrooms that were clustered together fell to the ground without a sound. The other mushrooms that weren't affected by the lightning scattered in all directions, hiding in the bushes, and behind trees. Grimm quickly walked to the side of the 5 mushrooms and put them into his pouch. Then, he picked up the round stone and quickly retreated to the gravel path. This was the thunderstone he bought at a high price from his acolyte, Rex. After vibrating, it could release forked lightning with an energy of 5 points, which was perfect for dealing with the weak life force of the mushrooms. After all, his own burning hand was not suitable for capturing, so he had to think of another way. After being frightened, the mushrooms no longer dared to show themselves. However, countless cold gazes and whispers accompanied Grimm, causing his hair to stand on end. These mushrooms were materials that had to be harvested during patrolling missions. Therefore, after completing this mission, Grimm continued along the winding path, not daring to stay any longer. To be honest, this was the dangerous area with the highest death rate for acolytes. After leaving the flower bed where the mushrooms were raised, Grimm quickly arrived at the area where the infant demons lived. Infant demons were small monsters that had shriveled bodies like human babies, dragging strange things that looked like umbilical cords behind them. They crawled on the ground, and their speed was also very fast. Their voices were even more ear-piercing, like the cries of babies. These infant demons weren't real babies, but a more terrifying type of monster. They were born with innate abilities similar to curse words. In other words, a portion of their words would resonate with their powerful consciousnesses and become reality. This was basically an unlimited prayer spell. Unfortunately, they were all evil creatures with extremely twisted minds, and their hearts were filled with malicious curses and hatred. Therefore, don't expect them to bestow you any good blessings. All you could get was a torrent of curses and insults. When dozens of infant demons gathered together and unleashed the most vicious curse at a single target, even a violent earth bear would be infected by the layers of malice, turning into a soft-footed crab, and then at their mercy. To walk among such a group of lunatics, one really needed a super strong and firm heart and will. Otherwise, one's skin and bones would be torn apart at any moment, and one's soul would also fall into their hands, becoming one of the many lost souls in this whispering garden. These special types of monsters all had their own territories, and they wouldn't easily trespass. Otherwise, it was not impossible for them to start a war between monsters. Therefore, when Grimm trotted along the winding path, the surrounding desolate garden grass was filled with strange sighs and groans. He didn't dare to stay here any longer. He could only hold the talisman tightly in front of his chest and walk forward with his head down. Finally, before the sharp and ear-piercing baby cries filled his ears, Grimm had already rushed out of the whispering garden and turned into another path. As a patrolling acolyte, Grimm's daily task was to find out the movements of monsters around the tower every 7 days, as well as harvest some suitable ingredients. This was almost all of Grimm's tasks. The area he was currently patrolling was still in the inner area of the magic swamp, and there were very few outsiders who could break into this area. After all, the monsters cultivated by the sorcerers were extremely dangerous. Even the sorcerer apprentices wearing witchcraft amulets might not be able to guarantee their safety. Those ordinary humans who wanted to sneak in here to steal the sorcerer's resources were even risking their lives. To be honest, it was difficult for such mortals to even pass through the outer area of the magic swamp. However, according to Grimm's knowledge, sometimes the wizard tower would intentionally release some of the outer restrictions, and even take the initiative to lure some mortals into the depths of the swamp. And at that time, it was usually the time when the magical creatures in the inner circle could feast and celebrate. The wizard tower was a huge ring-shaped tower. The geographical environment around its base was extremely complicated, and the distribution of monsters was even more irregular. Therefore, at least 2 apprentices were required to patrol each time. One would go in the direction of the main gate, and the other would go in the opposite direction. They would follow a fixed route through most of the monsters' living areas. They would set off from the main gate of the tower and meet up at the back gate. After completing such a closed circle, their patrol mission would basically be completed. Every patrol mission would bring them 4 knowledge points and a certain amount of gold coins. Compared to the other tower missions, the reward of knowledge points was extremely generous. But even so, many sorcerer apprentices who thirsted for knowledge still flinched at the sight of patrolling missions and avoided them. Apart from that, the death rate of the patrol mission was definitely the highest among all the tower missions. There was no one else. For this patrol, Grimm took the reverse route, which required him to pass through the killer forest, the human-faced mushroom farm, and the whispering garden. The other wizard apprentice, Tony, was walking in the main ring, so it was not much safer than him. After all, the swamp crocodiles, the old lady, and the parasite queen were not to be trifled with. Especially when harvesting the crocodiles' eggs and cocoons, they had to go deep into their nests. This made the patrol mission even more dangerous. Therefore, when Grimm saw Tony at the back gate of the tower, he was very pleased with his luck. The 2 of them did not talk much after seeing each other. They just nodded and entered the tower. Waiting for them was the head apprentice, Enkiso. After handing over the mission items, the 2 of them were completely free for the next 6 days. As for the knowledge points, Enkiso used a special method to record them into their talismans. Chapter 6. As soon as Tony handed in his mission, He rushed back to his room and wanted to have a good sleep. After all, every time he patrolled, his nerves would be stretched taut, and it would be extremely taxing on his spirit. Grimm hesitated for a moment, then turned around and walked to the library. It was noon, so there were not many students in the library. In a simple stone room, there were more than 10 yellow wooden bookshelves against the wall. They were densely packed with all kinds of magic books made of different materials and styles. The one in charge of them was a middle-aged wizard apprentice, an intermediate wizard apprentice. For apprentices like him who had to rely on the passage of time to climb to the intermediate level, the wizard tower would not put in any effort to cultivate them. Moreover, they had long since lost their previous ambitions. They were not willing to take on overly risky missions, nor were they willing to return to the life of mortals. Thus, they had become a special group among the wizard apprentices. As a librarian, although he could only get one knowledge point every 7 days, it was easy and comfortable. There was no danger, so it had long been taken over by the senior intermediate wizard apprentices. Apprentices like Grimm, who had no one to rely on, could only take on the most dangerous missions. Grimm did not turn around and go straight to the innermost bookshelves like before. Instead, he leisurely browsed through the bookshelves one by one, occasionally picking up a book to read. Since the books on sorcery in the library had not been borrowed yet, other than the introduction at the front, the contents of the latter pages were completely covered by a layer of floating black fog, making it impossible to see through them. Grimm did not dare to look down on this seemingly ordinary black fog. It was personally set up by the master of the tower, the terrifying Wizard Anderson. Without going through a special spell formation, no apprentice could hope to see the contents, not even a single word. Those who tried to use their own methods to break the spell would inevitably trigger the hidden spell formation, which would lead to the wrath and punishment of the wizard. Although it was so strict, Grimm still wanted to try and see if there was any room for opportunistic tricks with the biochip in this area. After all, it was too difficult to earn knowledge points. So far, Grimm only had 7 points, which was not enough to support his future studies. He took out a book called The History of Wizard Development and pretended to read it carefully. In the depths of his soul, a hidden order had been secretly transmitted to the biochip. Scan this book and see if you can obtain the contents without activating the spell formation. Beep! The command mission has been established. Beginning deep scan. Grimm lowered his head. When the biochip was scanning, the depths of his eyes would faintly emit red light, so he needed to cover it up a little to prevent others from noticing the abnormality in his eyes. Discovered unknown defensive force field. Analyzing. Beep, danger alert. Force field undergoing unknown changes. Scanning terminated. Grimm quickly closed his eyes and the book. As expected, it was still not enough. The tiniest bit of external stimulation could trigger a reaction from the protective spell formation on the book. It seemed that his opportunistic peeping operation was going to end in failure. If he wanted to obtain more knowledge in the future, he could only use knowledge points to exchange for it. However, there was nothing to be regretful about. After all, with the biochip, he no longer needed to use the most primitive method to memorize knowledge like before. As long as he borrowed a book once, he could copy all the knowledge in it into the AI chip storage area, making it convenient for him to access it at any time in the future. Even if it was difficult for him to grasp it, he could first store it and let the AI chip sort it out for him, then slowly comprehend the contents. With this, the AI chip's appearance was already a great help to him. Grudgingly putting down the history of wizard development, Grimm strolled to a bookshelf. Most of the books here were related to the use of fire elemental energy, which suited his elemental affinity. Hence, it was a place he frequented. The characteristics of fire elemental particles. Fire elemental control techniques. Burning hands. How to hold a large fireball. Some of the books here were purely theoretical discussions of witchcraft. Some were simple spellcasting experiences, and some were orthodox elemental spell models and spellcasting techniques. Among them, spellcasting books could help him master some essential witchcraft and increase his combat power, but they could not increase his knowledge. Only books on witchcraft theory could possibly bring about an increase in mental strength. Hence, how to use knowledge reasonably. Not only could he expand his grasp of spells and protect his life, but he could also increase his knowledge and work toward becoming an official magus. This was a difficult problem that tested the human heart. Hence, Grimm was once again at a loss as he looked at the rows of books that made one's heart beat faster. He sank into deep thought. Every power system had a solid and profound theoretical foundation, and the power of a sorcerer was rooted in the sorcery power system. So what did witchcraft represent? Without any explanation, Grimm gave the AI chip an almost impossible long-term mission. AI chip, collect all the basic information related to magic and trace it back to its origin. Find the most suitable path for me to advance in the future. Beep. Host mission has been accepted. Establishing long-term observation project. Origin of magic. Currently lacking information. Unable to construct complete model. Establishing short-term evaluation project. Host path as a magus. Currently lacking information. Unable to construct complete model. The continuous beeping alarms gave Grimm a headache. There was nothing he could do. The AI chip had just been revived, and the database was almost completely blank. If he did not think of a way to collect some basic books on magic, he would not be able to deduce the actual results just by thinking about it. Fortunately, he had copied some information in the past 6 years. When he got back, he would think of a way to input it into the AI chip. This way, he would not always be lacking information and be unable to do anything. Turning around and leaving the library, Grimm first went to the public dining hall to fill his stomach before returning to his residence. Pushing the door open, Grimm first scanned his feet. There was an extremely weak fluctuation of fire elemental energy on the floor by the door. These were fire elemental particles that he had specially placed at the door, and they were not very useful. However, when anyone passed by, their elemental energy would inadvertently change the order of the fire elemental particles. Therefore, Grimm could use this method to determine whether someone had entered his room or not. There was no helping it. In this group of people with unfathomable intentions, those who did not have a sense of self-preservation would not live long. Closing the door, Grimm could not wait to take out the magic notes that he had painstakingly copied over the past few years. Counting carefully, Grimm now had 5 complete magic books in his hands. The first one was, of course, Omniscience. This was the introductory book for all wizard apprentices. Grimm sat upright in front of the wooden table, meticulously reading through the book, Study of Everything. Although most of the content had become part of his memory, he could not help but forget some of the details. Now, not only was he silently reading, even the AI chip was using his eyes to input all the knowledge into his memory and stored it in different categories. In the end, Grimm did not waste any effort in thinking and reading. He simply turned himself into a human photocopier. His eyes flickered as he copied every word, every symbol, every magic line, every figure in the book. He quickly copied them down. In less than a quarter of an hour, the entire Omniscience was stored. Grimm could not help but be speechless. It should be known that this Study of Everything was an introductory book for sorcerer apprentices. It recorded almost 10,000 different races and different types of strange creatures that had been discovered on the sorcerer continent. There were also the majority of plants, animals, minerals, and special ingredients that could be seen on a daily basis. There were about 30,000 entries in the book. Back then, it took him 17 months to completely read through it, but now it only took him less than a quarter of an hour to finish storing it. While sighing at the power of the AI chip, Grimm closed the book and began to slowly recall the content. As long as Grimm willed it, the AI chip would automatically retrieve the relevant data and information from the storage area and project it into his mind. This saved Grimm a lot of time searching for information. Good, this was indeed effective. He would no longer have to worry about obscure magic knowledge in the future. In his excitement, Grimm could not care less about the pain in his head. He quickly took out the second book and began to copy it in the same way. The Origin of Spiritual Force was a proper book on magic theory. It mainly described the origin and application of spiritual force, which was commonly used by wizards, as well as some simple ways to train one's spiritual force. After recording the second book, Grimm gently stroked his swollen head. He felt a wave of nausea and dizziness. His chest felt so tight that he wanted to vomit. This was a sign that his spiritual force had been exhausted. As a wizard apprentice, he was very familiar with this situation. When he first learned the Burning Hand, Grimm would often exhaust his spiritual force because he could not control the rhythm of his wizard power output. Later on, when he became more and more proficient in using the Burning Hand, he learned how to use spiritual force without a teacher. As a wizard, the strength of one's spiritual force and the strength of one's soul were directly proportional. The stronger one's soul was, the more spiritual force one would have, and the more spells one would be able to cast. Take Grimm, for example. His spiritual force was 8 points, so his magic power was 10 times that of his spiritual force, which was 80 points. Of course, some wizards like to call this magic power wizard power. Chapter 7. A simple flaming hand spell required around 2 points of spiritual force, which meant that Grimm could cast Flaming Hand 4 times in a row. Of course, this was only a theoretical value. It was very difficult to achieve in reality, as spiritual force was what acolytes relied on to cast spells. The higher the spiritual force, the more spiritual force the acolyte had. Whether it was thinking or casting spells, they would be able to achieve the best results. However, as the spiritual force continued to be consumed, when the value fell below 1/3, the host would enter a state of mental exhaustion. At this time, dizziness, nausea, and listlessness were the most common symptoms. Casting spells at this time, a spell that could normally be completed in 5 seconds, might not even be completed in 10 seconds, and the failure rate would also increase exponentially. Therefore, when a magus frequently cast spells, they would try their best to preserve a portion of their spiritual force, in order to avoid the side effects of completely exhausting their spiritual force. Grimm's current symptoms meant that his spiritual force had fallen below 5%, and he had entered a state of mental exhaustion. The only solution to this situation was to have a good sleep, and use sufficient sleep to restore his mental strength. The AI chip was very useful, but it consumed Grimm's spiritual force when it was running. Feeling that his body was not in a good condition, Grimm struggled to climb onto his bed and fell into a deep sleep. Night quickly descended, when a huge moon vaguely appeared in the dusky sky. The candles in the tower were extinguished one after another. The originally cold, swamp tower became even more deathly silent. Unknowingly, a tall and strange shadow suddenly appeared in front of Grimm's bed. It bent down slightly and stared at him silently. Due to the huge consumption of spiritual force, Grimm did not sleep well. Even in his dreams, his eyebrows were tightly knitted, as if he was in great pain. The strange shadow's back was facing the moonlight, and its entire body was immersed in an indescribable darkness. Its appearance could not be seen clearly, but a pair of blood-red eyes shone brightly, sending chills down anyone's spine. Blood! Blood! I want blood. The black shadow tremblingly stretched out his hands, wanting to strangle Grimm's neck, but he would always withdraw his hands inexplicably, as if he was extremely unwilling in his heart, as if he was having an intense internal struggle. Moreover, its mouth was repeatedly muttering these words, showing that it was in a chaotic mental state. Finally, a trace of clarity in its intelligence freed it from its intense desire for blood. It glanced at Grimm, who was completely unaware of what was happening, and jumped out of the narrow window. Outside the window was the almost straight Qinghui stone tower. As a wizard tower, it was naturally attached with terrible witchcraft arrays, so it was impossible for outsiders to enter and exit at will. However, what was extremely strange was that this black shadow was like a gecko as it moved around the body of the tower, but it did not trigger any spell formation. And this was obviously something only an acolyte with a protective spell could do. The shadow moved quickly around the periphery of the wizard tower. The speed and agility of its movements were simply breathtaking. Moreover, when it moved, it purposely chose the dark corners of the window sill and the places where the moonlight did not shine. Thus, its movements seemed even more erratic and strange. Its movements were both swift and light, and it did not make the slightest sound as it moved. Moreover, it had an ulterior motive. It deliberately avoided a few secret rooms that were still lit by candles, and after searching for a long time, it finally found the most suitable target. It hung in front of a narrow window and listened for a while. After making sure that the breathing sound coming from inside was steady and continuous, it carefully climbed into the narrow window. This time, it stayed a little longer. When it crawled out of the hole again, a faint smell of blood drifted beside it. This successful hunt obviously made the black shadow very satisfied. When it squatted on the narrow window and was about to slip away, it inadvertently raised its head and looked at the moon in the sky. At this moment, a huge bright moon emerged from the dark clouds, and the bright silver-gray moonlight shone down from the sky, shining on its body. It was the face of a young girl. She was beautiful, and her skin was white. Two strange vampiric fangs, slightly protruded from her lips, were faintly stained with blood. The beautiful girl's delicate tongue gently licked her fangs, sucking the blood on them into her mouth. Only then did she jump out of the window and disappear into the shadows where the moonlight could not reach. The next day, Grimm was woken up by a series of hurried knocks on his door. Shaking his slightly dizzy head, Grimm opened the door and was surprised to find 3 people standing outside. Head Acolyte Anxur, Acolyte Alan, and Fenrir. Anxur's position as the head acolyte was personally appointed by Wizard Anderson, so his position was slightly more important. Usually, he could represent the wizard in some of his duties and manage all the acolytes in the tower. Furthermore, he also had the strength of an intermediate acolyte, so all the acolytes had to obey his orders. Otherwise, if he bore a grudge against you and did something to your tower mission, you wouldn't even know how to write the word death. As for the other 2, Alan and Fenrir, they were also beginner acolytes like Grimm. However, they were the best at bootlicking, so they surrounded Anxur all day long to please him. Therefore, they could be considered the head acolyte's trusted aides. Therefore, as long as Anxur appeared, these 2 bootlickers would definitely be around. The relationship between them was more like the relationship between a killer tree and a vampiric vine. The 2 bootlickers needed Anxur's care in order to get the easier and safer daily missions. And Anxur also needed the support of these 2 acolytes to intimidate those ambitious people. Because of Grimm's cold and unsociable personality, he rarely interacted with outsiders, so his relationship with them could only be considered not bad. Therefore, he was extremely surprised to see them suddenly appear in front of his door. Head Acolyte Anxur was a young man in his 20s. He had a hooked nose and sharp eyes. Although he did not look fierce, he always gave off a domineering and oppressive aura. The moment the wooden door opened, Anxur's flashing eyes landed on Grimm's face, giving him a faint feeling that his skin was being burned. Grimm's heart shuddered. He understood that this was a phenomenon that would occur when someone's strength had reached a certain level and their spiritual force was overflowing. Among the acolytes in the Wizard Tower, there was actually a strict hierarchy. Those who mastered 1 or 2 spells and had a spiritual force of less than 10 points were considered beginner acolytes, the lowest of the group. Those who mastered 3 or 4 spells and had a spiritual force of 11 to 15 points were considered intermediate acolytes, already considered to have some power. Those who mastered more than 5 spells and had a spiritual force of more than 16 points were considered the elites of the Wizard Tower, advanced acolytes. Once an acolyte's spiritual force reached the threshold of 20 points, he would have the qualifications to become a prospective sorcerer and would be looked upon favorably by the sorcerers, beginning to prepare for the ritual of breaking through to become a sorcerer in the future. Unfortunately, The Swamp Tower currently did not have a true prospective sorcerer. As for this Anksur, although it was unknown how many spells he had mastered, with some special sorcery tools, he could sometimes display strength that was no weaker than that of an advanced acolyte. Within the Wizard Tower, there were only 3 acolytes with the strength of an advanced acolyte: Hawkeye, Evil Bug, and Mad Girl. Of course, this was not their name, but their nickname. Hawkeye was called Crusar, a terrifying fellow from the West Coast. In order to increase his own strength, he actually transplanted a Hawkeye into himself and obtained some strange abilities. Evil Bug was called Intich, a fellow even more sinister than Hawkeye. He actually used his own flesh and blood to raise a group of frightening insects. When fighting with him, a single mistake would result in the frightening ending of thousands of insects devouring one's heart. The last one, Mad Girl, was extremely violent. With a giant iron sword that was far taller than an ordinary person, she was unrivaled among acolytes. She was also a terrifying fellow that no one dared to provoke. These people either mastered powerful spells or possessed strange special abilities. They had long since left their status as ordinary acolytes and became the most promising candidates to become prospective sorcerers in the Wizard Tower. Thus, when faced with the burning gaze of a powerful acolyte, Grimm's spirit was obviously unable to take it, and his mind was greatly suppressed. Grimm, something happened in the Wizard Tower last night. Do you know? Head acolyte Anksur stared coldly at Grimm and did not open his mouth. Instead, it was Alan who was beside him who was shouting. Something happened? What happened? Someone was killed by the backlash of a witchcraft experiment? Grimm clearly did not understand the situation. It's not the backlash of a witchcraft experiment. Someone was killed. It was in his residence. Seeing that Grimm's confused and surprised expression did not seem to be fake, Anksur spoke slowly. His gaze did not miss any change in Grimm's expression. Kill. Grimm was shocked at first, then shocked. Who died? Although acolytes died from accidents in the Swamp Tower from time to time, most of them died from dangerous missions or from the backlash of strange witchcraft experiments. There had never been a case of an acolyte being killed by someone else. After all, every acolyte was a precious asset to the Wizard Anderson of the Wizard Tower. He would never allow acolytes to kill each other due to internal strife. If he discovered such a thing, the violator would definitely be severely punished. Miri. Grimm frowned. He knew this Miri. He was also an ordinary acolyte who had only mastered one spell. As for other things, he did not know much about him. He only vaguely remembered that Miri was a boy with a face full of freckles, and he was even younger than him. Then why did you come looking for me? We need to check your room. This is not specifically for you, but all suspicious acolytes must be checked, Anksur said coldly. Yes, everyone's room must be checked. Get out of the way, or else can you bear the consequences if the great wizard blames you? Finner was undoubtedly the most annoying person, and she was desperately shouting at the side. Grimm's heart was filled with anger, but he clenched his teeth and slowly suppressed it. Check everyone. Do you dare to search Hawkeye's room? Do you dare to search the demonic worm's room? Not to mention the Mad Lady's room. I'm afraid that if you really meet the Mad Lady, you'll have to take a detour. Chapter 8. His room was already cramped. It was no more than 20 square meters, and he could see everything in the room just by standing at the door. There was a bed, a simple yellow writing desk, and a few books were piled on top of it. One of the books was already open, and one could vaguely see the strange and mysterious rune lines on it. There was also an old chair, the paint on it almost peeling off, revealing the original dark color of the wood. There was a row of glassware on a wooden shelf at the side of the room, and one could vaguely see some half-cultivated strange plants and special organs of monsters. There was a wooden box in the corner, and there was a rubbish bin beside it. Other than that, there was almost no other furniture. Alan and Finner had a look of disdain in their eyes. Although they were all acolytes, the two of them were 100 times better off than Grimm. Not only did the bedroom have a soft and comfortable bed, the decorations in the room were no less luxurious than those of human nobles. How could this kennel in front of them compare? Perhaps to show their authority, the two acolytes quickly walked into the room and began to rummage through it. The bedding on the wooden bed was overturned, and the books on the table were also turned upside down. The overturned ink bottle splashed a large pool of ink onto the open books. The wooden box was also opened, and some of the clothes inside were thrown out. Looking at the two lackeys searching the room, Enkiso still stood expressionlessly at the door, not moving an inch. He had no intention of stopping them. Grim stood by the door, his hands clenched and unclenched in his sleeves. His eyes were filled with coldness and hatred. Finally, the search of the room was over. Under the proud and provocative gazes of the two, Grim coldly closed the wooden door. He quickly walked to the overturned wooden box, and after searching through the messy clothes for a while, he finally could not help but curse in a low voice. Python grass, mountain sage, black lotus, wild steel flower, graveyard moss. He had risked his life for so many patrols, and the materials he had painstakingly collected in the magic swamp were all gone. He didn't need to think too much to know that the two of them must have stolen it when they were searching. Although he wanted to rush out and reason with the other party, the thought of Enkiso's cold and sinister face made Grim's heart turn cold. The other party was obviously using investigating Miri's death as an excuse to plunder resources from ordinary acolytes. Furthermore, with their status as chief apprentice Enkiso, no one dared to fight them head-on. Of course, these bastards wouldn't be stupid enough to provoke those powerful figures. They only dared to target small figures like Grim, who were alone. Soon, the wooden door next door was also knocked on by them. Of course, they were well aware of what had happened to Miri. She had not appeared for a long time. Using this opportunity, head apprentice Ansel also wanted to check if she was alive or dead. However, just as Alan impatiently slapped the wooden door and was about to break in, there was a creaking sound, and the wooden door actually opened inwards. Following which, a young girl in a red dress appeared in front of everyone. "Oh, it's Senior Enkiso. I haven't thanked you for the mission you arranged for me previously." The young girl's gentle voice was extremely charming, but it still couldn't be compared to her appearance. This was a beautiful young girl with slender limbs. Her skin was as flawless as white jade, and her face was exquisite and perfect. Her small red lips always had a hint of a smile. The most eye-catching thing about her was her pair of sparkling, blood-red eyes. They were like two pure, sparkling, and flawless rubies embedded in her exquisite face. She was exceptionally charming. She wore a bright red dress that revealed her perfect figure. The large patch of skin that was exposed outside the dress was so white that it made one dizzy. In this gloomy swamp tower, most of the sorcerer apprentices were uniformly dressed in gray apprentice robes and black robes. Therefore, dark colors became the main theme here. Seeing such a dazzling and beautiful young girl today, the few of them could not help but stare blankly and stutter, not knowing what to say. Furthermore, ever since they saw this beautiful young girl's appearance, the three of them had an indescribable desire in their hearts, burning them with unbearable hunger and thirst. Enkiso was indeed worthy of being the head acolyte specially chosen by the great Magus. In terms of spiritual self-control, he was far stronger than the other two. When Alan and Fenrir couldn't help but reveal their perverted faces, as if they were enchanted with lust, Ansel suddenly broke free from a pink illusion. "Who are you? Tell me your name, or else." Enkiso's expression changed abruptly. He took 2 steps back and pressed his hands on his waist pouch. In such a huge Magus tower, all the acolytes were very familiar with each other. After all, there were only about 40 to 50 people in this group. Furthermore, they had lived together for many years, so it was difficult to not be familiar with each other. Even Grim, who had a cold and unsociable personality, had 1 or 2 friends he could talk to, not to mention a head acolyte like Enkiso who dealt with different acolytes on a daily basis. It was not an exaggeration to say that Enkiso could recite the basic information of all the acolytes on the first 3 floors of this Magus tower with his eyes closed. But no matter how hard he searched his memories, he could not find any acolyte that matched the girl in red in front of him. Wait, She walked out of Mary's room. As for Mary, who came from a remote city, the biggest impression she left on Ankiso was that she was stubborn and had a stubborn attitude. However, in terms of looks, Mary, who came from a noble family, was a rare beauty among female acolytes. It was a pity that she was too ignorant and ignored Ankiso's invitations to go to his room at night. Hence, when Magus Anderson urgently needed an acolyte to assist him, Ankiso enthusiastically recommended her. Could it be Ankiso's thoughts spun rapidly? The image of the timid and weak little beauty with freckles on both sides of her nose gradually overlapped with the flamboyant girl in red in front of him. Finally, he opened his mouth wide and almost cried out, You Mary." Perhaps the name Mary had inadvertently hurt the red-clothed girl. Her charming and beautiful face suddenly twisted, and her cherry lips suddenly split open, turning into a terrifying bloody maw. The girl in red pounced and bit down on Ankiso's exposed neck. With just one bite, half of Ankiso's neck disappeared, revealing the scarlet flesh and broken trachea. Fresh blood spurted out like a fountain, staining the ground, the walls, and the girl in red. The thick, pungent smell of blood permeated the entire corridor. Ankiso's entire body slammed into the cold, hard wall, and he slid to the floor, twitching and trembling. His hands pulled out a scorpion-shaped wizard tool from his waist pouch. A sharp, fiery ray of heat shot out from it, piercing through the girl in red's chest. This scorching ray was an extremely powerful fire element spell. The extremely high temperature and heat contained within it instantly burned a goose egg-sized wound on the young girl's delicate body. The ray of heat penetrated her body and even pierced a hole in the corridor wall behind the girl. After completing this spell attack, Ankiso casually threw away the wizard tool and took out a fist-sized bottle of green liquid from his waist pouch with trembling hands. He removed the cap and was about to pour it onto the huge wound on his neck. Ankiso's life force was really tenacious. Even with such a terrifying injury, he did not die immediately. Instead, the neck that had been bitten off suddenly showed signs of rotting. The exposed skin and flesh quickly dehydrated, and the fountain of blood that had been spurting out earlier also gradually stopped. A part of his body had turned into a zombie. This was probably the trump card he had been hiding. After learning about biological structure, anatomy, and necromancy, sorcerer apprentices could use spells to transplant something called the zombie rotting sac into their bodies. This way, if they were to suffer a serious injury, they could activate the rotting sac to turn a part of their body into a zombie to prevent a fatal injury. However, using this method to save their lives could only be used in emergencies. Once their lives were saved, getting rid of the dense negative energy in their bodies would become a new problem. However, when faced with the choice of life and death, most sorcerer apprentices would choose to preserve their lives first. As for the negative energy, they could deal with it after they were saved. However, in the next second, a huge shadow was cast on his body. Ankiso held his neck that was about to break off with one hand and the small bottle in the other. He suddenly raised his head, just in time to see the girl in red open her fangs. On her body, viscous purple blood was trickling out of the bloody hole that had penetrated through her body. Purple blood. Is she still human? This quickly became the last thought that lingered in Ankiso's mind. The girl in red pounced forward again and lay on Ankiso's body, sucking the blood that was gushing out of his neck in a frenzy. The gurgling sounds of swallowing could be heard clearly. The two sorcerer apprentices, who had been abandoned to the side and had no time to deal with it, had already gathered up the crude tools that stored spells in their hands. However, in the face of such a bloody and terrifying scene, the two of them were already shivering and did not dare to activate the tools in their hands. Even head apprentice Ankiso's powerful witchcraft could not truly harm this red-cloaked monster. The witchcraft in their hands would not be able to kill it. If they did not know what was good for them and angered the other party, who knew if the monster in red would pounce on them, eat their flesh, drink their blood, and chew on their bones. Just as the two of them were shivering with their backs against the wall, the girl in red had already stopped sucking. She sat up with her back facing the two acolytes. She took out a snow-white handkerchief and a small round mirror and wiped the corners of her lips, looking very satisfied. The terrifying bloody hole in her abdomen actually healed quickly under the effect of a mysterious force. In the blink of an eye, it was as clean as before, once again turning into smooth, white, and snow-white skin. Not even a small scar could be found. What a terrifying, blood-sucking regeneration ability. Could it be? Could it be that she was one of the dark nobles in the rumors? A vampire? Through the small gap in the door, Grimm saw everything that had happened just now. He had no idea how his neighbor next door, who had been contaminated by spells, had turned from a young girl into a vampire. However, he was sincerely pleased with head apprentice Ankiso's accidental death. At this point in the battle, even the death of an acolyte, no matter how slow the tower sorcerer was, he should have sensed something. Chapter 9. After cleaning up the bloodstains on her face, the red-clothed young lady turned around. That delicate and charming face once again appeared before the eyes of the two sorcerer apprentices. Fenrir, who was unable to withstand such a strong visual impact, finally fainted. Mary's ferocious and terrifying appearance had been completely concealed, and she had once again become that tall, beautiful girl. However, her scarlet and glaring eyes and the pair of sharp fangs that protruded from her lips revealed her identity without a doubt. Half of her body was soaked in blood, but she still had a charming white face. Such a strong visual contrast, even Grimm, who was peeking through the crack of the door, couldn't help but tremble with fear. A newborn vampire was not afraid of any physical damage. As long as their attacks could cause the enemy to lose blood, they would be able to gain endless vitality from the fresh blood. This kind of long-lived species only existed in ancient books of the wizard continent. Because wizards hunted them in large numbers, they were almost extinct. Even if there were some that survived, they would escape into the wild forest or live in seclusion in human society, not daring to show themselves. Therefore, Grimm was greatly shocked by Mary's sudden transformation into a vampire. But besides the shock, he couldn't help but feel a chill from the bottom of his heart because of the strange means of wizards. What kind of witchcraft experiments did Mary go through to turn an ordinary human girl into a bloodthirsty ancient species? Could it be that the strange sounds he heard at night were Mary's mutation? Just as the red-clothed girl, Mary, approached Alan, whose body was trembling nonstop, the torches on both sides of the originally slightly dim stone wall corridor suddenly lit up. A strange figure stepped out from the shadows of the wall and shouted softly, "Stop, my child. Today's slaughter is enough for you to complete the last step of evolution. From now on, you must try to restrain your desire for blood and return to the ranks of the seekers of knowledge." The newcomer had a stooped body, and his face was full of wrinkles and loose skin. He was wearing a pure black wizard robe and a pointy wizard hat. The top of the twisted wizard staff in his hand was inlaid with a huge green crystal. Specks of fluorescent light overflowed from it and scattered in the air. This old man was the only master of this wizard tower, the great Wizard Anderson. As for his rank as a wizard, Grimm had no way of knowing. Although he had a hunch that today's events would alarm the master of the tower, Grimm knew the situation and withdrew the elemental sight from his eyes. However, when Wizard Anderson suddenly appeared, the intense wizard power radiation that covered his entire body still made him want to cry. Grimm gently closed the wooden door and quietly hid in his room, no longer daring to peek outside. If he were to discover some secrets that Wizard Anderson didn't want others to know, his little life would be in danger. These official sorcerers were all demons who killed without batting an eyelid. They would often use living creatures to conduct all sorts of dangerous and evil witchcraft experiments. No matter how careful he was, there was no way he could hide from Wizard Anderson's power of the will. However, this kind of action was a kind of attitude, indicating that he would not pry into the secrets of the Magi. At least until something really happened, he was still safe. Outside the door, only separated by a wall, an embarrassing confrontation was still going on. At this time, Mary had once again turned into that ferocious and scary look. Her scarlet eyes flashed with a beast-like glow. The nails on her hands began to grow crazily and finally turned into claws with a cold glint. Mary, who had turned into a vampire, was obviously stimulated by the thick smell of blood. Her whole body was crawling on the ground like a gecko, quickly moving on the vertical stone wall at an extremely high speed. The target of her attack was the master of the Wizard Tower, Wizard Anderson. Mary quickly ran along the stone walls on both sides. When she got close to the wizard, her powerful hind legs gave a powerful kick, and her slender body pounced towards the wizard like lightning. While her body was still in midair, Mary's claws reached forward and viciously dug towards the wizard's heart. Facing a newborn vampire that had gone berserk, Wizard Anderson's face only had a ferocious smile and joy, but he did not panic at all. The long wizard staff in his hand only stopped for a moment, and a whirlwind shot out from it, blocking Mary's path of attack. A modified body is a modified body after all. Her bloodthirsty nature has suppressed her own intelligence. What a pity! What a pity! After the modification, Mary's body was on the lighter side. She belonged to the category of small humanoid creatures, so her attacks focused on speed and agility. Unfortunately, in the eyes of a magus, these extraordinary talents were not a threat at all. Therefore, as soon as Mary's claws pierced into the whirlwind, she was sucked in, unable to escape. In the end, as the whirlwind's suction force became stronger, Mary let out a scream of surprise. Her body was sucked in, spinning in the whirlwind for a long time. Her head was dizzy. Under Wizard Anderson's control, the whirlwind spat Mary out with a flick of its tail, and she slammed heavily on the stone wall. Although the impact this time was not strong, it still made her lose her ability to fight. Even through the wooden door, Grimm could hear the crisp sound of bones cracking. A newborn vampire that has lost its intelligence. What use do I have for you? Go die. Wizard Anderson smiled viciously and gently lifted his withered right hand. A pale white undead flame floated above his palm, and with a flip of his hand, he pressed it towards Mary's forehead, who was still struggling and moaning. Perhaps it was because Mary sensed death was approaching. The vampiric aura that was extremely sensitive to danger finally disappeared. Suddenly, Mary let out an ear-piercing scream. She tried her best to hide her body, and her dark green eyes revealed a deep fear of the undead flame. Wizard Anderson let out a soft sound of surprise and stopped what he was doing. The undead flame that did not seem to have any temperature was burning coldly, but did not have the crackling sound that a normal flame should have. The dancing white flame made Mary's pale face look even whiter, as if it was covered with a thick layer of stone powder. The fear of death can help you regain your intelligence. This is a phenomenon that I have never seen before. It's worth researching. Wizard Anderson mumbled to himself and put out the undead flame with his right hand. Afterward, he gently flicked his finger, and tens of small whirlwinds suddenly appeared on Mary's neck, limbs, and all the joints that could move, tightly binding her. He turned his head and looked at the remains of Ankasoro. Since Mary had been so cruel when she was feeding, all the blood in her body had been sucked dry. Therefore, the remains of Ankasoro's body were rotting very quickly. The originally smooth and supple skin was now wrinkled like a corpse that had been buried underground for more than 10 years. The original head acolyte is dead, so you will take over. Remember to take care of these acolytes for me, said Wizard Anderson with a slight frown. He then pointed at Alan, who was barely holding on to the stone wall, and ordered coldly. As soon as he finished speaking, the light from the torches in the stone corridor suddenly dimmed. When they returned to normal, the figure of Wizard Anderson and Mary could no longer be seen in the entire corridor. He had just witnessed a bloody feast, and after escaping death, he was unexpectedly promoted to head apprentice. Alan's body was trembling nonstop, his pants were wet, and his face showed an expression that was hard to distinguish between joy and surprise. Suddenly, he thought of something and fell on top of Ankasoro's remains. He frantically searched for the items in his waist pouch. Since he had become a head acolyte, the protective spell amulet on Ankasoro's body would belong to him. He had to get it as soon as possible. Waist pouch, arms, neck, leather boots, in short, he had searched every place that he could hide his items. Just a moment ago, this horrifying corpse had made him feel extremely terrified, but now it had become his treasure trove, making him unable to contain his joy. Finally, he found the protective spell amulet from the ghastly hole in the neck of the corpse. He raised his hands and laughed loudly, not knowing how crazy his actions seemed to others. Fenrir, who had fainted on the floor, wriggled and struggled to stand up against the stone wall. In his hidden gaze towards Alan, there was a trace of astonishing killing intent that could not be concealed. He had actually woken up a long time ago. He had only pretended to be unconscious because he could not predict the situation. He did not expect that a single mistake would cause him to miss the chance to become a head acolyte. At this moment, he could not wait to devour Alan's flesh. Why didn't that vampire bite him to death? Fenrir roared in his heart, but on the surface, he quickly concealed the disappointment and irritation in his heart. When he crawled up from the ground, he had a flattering smile on his face. "Senior Alan, get up quickly. The floor here is very dirty. Let me help you clean up the rest of the rubbish." Fenrir's intervention quickly brought Alan back to his senses. Alan quickly got up and tidied up his appearance. He played with the witchcraft amulet in his hand, and a sly and noble smile appeared on his face. "I'll leave this place to you. Something has happened to the original head acolyte. I need to quickly inform everyone of this news. I'll have to trouble you here. I remember that those swamp crocodiles should also be feeding." Alan's words seemed to be squeezed out from between his teeth, revealing traces of coldness. Understood. I'll do it now." Fenrir's head could not help but hang lower. After enjoying the pleasure of power for the first time, Alan could not help but laugh loudly again. He walked quickly along the long corridor. Enkiso's belongings had already been plundered clean, but there might be some good stuff in his room. Hence, he left the mess to Fenrir and rushed to the end of the corridor impatiently. Chapter 10. The news of the new head acolyte's appearance was spread to all the apprentices during dinner. The apprentices who were eating quietly in the dining hall did not have much to say about the new head acolyte's replacement. No one even asked about Anxur's whereabouts. However, compared to Senior Alan /S complacency, Grim /S heart was filled with unconcealable contempt. Although the previous head acolyte was not a good person, Lihau was also a strong wizard who had mastered 3 or 4 spells. Although he was not as good as Hawkeye, Evil Bug, and Mad Girl, he was still much stronger than most of the junior apprentices. Otherwise, why would they swallow their anger and let him exploit them? Alan's background was clear to everyone. He was just a rookie who had mastered Windblade and Whirlwind Shield, hiding in the Wizard Tower all year round without taking a step out. His combat skills were also a mess. If they were to really fight, perhaps half of the sorcerer apprentices present would be able to easily defeat him. However, looking at the 4 dog acolytes around him, it was obvious that he also understood this point. That was why he was able to rope in a few helpers in such a short time. Just as Alan was trying his best to express his acceptance speech, the wooden door of the restaurant was kicked open and slammed against the stone wall beside him. Immediately, a young man with a cold face and a pirate's black eye patch walked into the dining hall. Alan's speech came to an abrupt end, and in every corner of the dining hall, Hawkeye's exclamation could not help but be heard. The young man with the pirate's black eye patch was one of the 3 strongest wizard acolytes, Hawkeye. As the top 3 experts, each of them had gathered some subordinates around them. Therefore, the 3 of them had never come to this dining hall to eat. All the food was directly sent to their rooms by their subordinates, and they lived a leisurely life. It was because of this that the apprentices were surprised by the sudden appearance of a strong wizard like Hawkeye in the dining hall. Of course, Hawkeye did not come to the dining hall to eat, but to find someone. When Hawkeye's powerful gaze swept through the entire dining hall, all the apprentices who met his eyes could not help but lower their heads. It couldn't be helped. The other party's gaze was too intense. Seeing the other party striding towards him, Grimm's heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly lowered his head even more. Unfortunately, Hawkeye's legs were still standing in front of him. "Are you Grimm? Come out and come with me." Hawkeye's words were few, but with indisputable toughness. After he finished speaking, he turned around and left, as if he didn't care about the reactions of the people present. Grimm smiled bitterly, pushed away the plate in front of him, stood up, and followed Eagle's step out of the restaurant. Even without looking back, Grimm could vaguely feel the cold gaze from the new apprentice, Alan, on him. Grimm could vaguely guess the purpose of their visit. So when he followed the lean figure of Hawkeye through several turns, through long, dark corridors, and finally in front of a wooden door, he was even more convinced of his conjecture. This was the madwoman's room, and the people waiting inside were none other than the other two of the three most famous apprentices, Pestilence and the madwoman. This was a stone room that was almost as simple as Grimm's room, and there were only a few things inside. Apart from a large and sturdy wooden bed, there was a writing desk and a chair, and there was nothing else. Oh no! In the corner, there was an all-metal humanoid statue. Judging from the crisscrossing scratches and sword marks on it, it was probably the most frequently used object in the room. The madwoman's iconic steel sword was hanging on the side of the wall. Hawkeye, Pestilence, and the madwoman did not usually have a harmonious relationship, but when it came to matters that concerned their personal interests, their small group could obviously advance and retreat together. This was the madwoman's room, and the only one who could speak here was the madwoman. When Grimm awkwardly stood in the middle of the room, the one who attracted his attention the most was, of course, the madwoman, who stood with her arms crossed and looked like a barbarian. The mad lady didn't wear a light and soft robe like the other apprentices. Instead, she wore a simple leather armor over her linen bra. His leather armor was stretched taut by his bulging muscles. His muscles were as dense as iron ingots, which made Grimm extremely envious. To be honest, even if he searched deep in his memory, Grimm had never seen a woman with such a strong and fiery body. "I heard that you saw what happened in the afternoon. Tell us everything you know. If there is any valuable information, we will give you a reward." Of course, it was the madwoman who spoke. Her voice was as sonorous as her person. Pestilence, who was hidden in a thick cloak, only moved his hood slightly, as if he was nodding. Hawkeye, who brought Grimm here, also had no objections. Half an hour later, Grimm returned to his residence without a hitch. When he closed the door, he could not help but put his back against the cold wooden door and thought to himself, "Any results from the detection just now? Hurry up and give me the data." Beep. Biological detection completed. The specific results are as follows. As the information flowed through his mind, some information about the three powerhouses began to slowly form. Since the biochip was activated, he had not made any progress in sorting out the witchcraft system due to the lack of the most direct and accurate first-hand information. Name: Crazy Girl Identity, Wizard Apprentice Race, Human, Barbarian, Attributes, Strength 15, Agility, 8 Vitality, 16 Spiritual Force, 17 Seeing Crazy Girl's Physique. Grimm felt a sense of helplessness from the bottom of his heart. Strength: 15 points, Vitality: 16 points. Is she even human? With these stats, there is not much difference between her and a magical beast in the forest, right? In terms of basic strength, a difference of 5 points would result in a terrifying knockback effect. A difference of 10 points would result in an unimaginable shattering effect. Between Grimm and Crazy Girl, the disparity in strength had reached an astonishing 11 points. Did this not mean that even if the two of them fought barehanded, Grimm would still be as weak as a glass statue in front of her? Not to mention a solid hit. Even the force of Crazy Girl's iron fist would cause him to vomit blood and fall to the ground, never to get up again. All kinds of battle scenes naturally appeared in his mind, and every time, it ended with him being beaten up. As for the 16 points of vitality, it showed the huge disparity between the two of them. Even if Crazy Girl stood still and allowed Grimm to attack with his flaming hands, he would not be able to kill her within 2 to 3 minutes. After comparing these basic stats, Grimm once again realized how insignificant he was. If he only relied on his own hard work, the gap between him and these talented people would only grow bigger under the amplification effect of his innate quality. It would be impossible to make up for it. Therefore, if he wanted to establish a foothold in this world, the only thing he could rely on was the biochip that had fused with his genes. After understanding all this, Grimm finally had the chance to check his harvest today. With a flip of his hand, a thick book that could be used to smash people appeared in Grimm's hand. Relying on his eloquence and the experience of watching with his own eyes, Grimm truthfully described every detail of Red Dress Mary's every move. This undoubtedly won him the favor of the three people, which was why he obtained this strange witchcraft book. According to the rules of the Wizard Tower, it was strictly forbidden to exchange knowledge within a tower. The witchcraft knowledge copied by apprentices was not allowed to be exchanged, or else they would be severely punished by the master of the Wizard Tower. Therefore, this book should have been obtained by Crazy Girl from the outside world. Otherwise, she would not have dared to give it to him so casually. Grimm could not help but hold his breath and turn to the first page. Chapter 11. Puppets constructs created by powerful wizard power elemental automatons. They use a special mysterious substance to refine anti-magic steel from the prime material realm. Their greatest characteristic is that they are resistant to elements. Lilo, automatons were usually created by wizards. Constructs were mostly created by wizards and were unnatural objects. Puppets were one of the most powerful products. The biggest characteristic of puppets was that they were resistant to elements. In other words, only those with the ability to reduce elemental damage could be called puppets. It was precisely because wizards were powerful that the ability to reduce elemental damage was so powerful. However, the elemental damage reduction did not mean that the puppet creatures could become mages. The elemental damage reduction only made them immune to spells that targeted the puppet creatures themselves. For example, using a fireball to smash the ceiling or using acid bog to trap the puppet creatures in an acid swamp would be very effective against them. Moreover, puppets had low spiritual force and could only listen to simple orders, which was their weakness against intelligent life. In fact, puppets were not completely immune to elements. Specific elemental spells would have specific effects on specific puppets. Making good use of their weaknesses would make it easier to fight against puppets. Puppets were powerful mechanical creatures created by witchcraft. They were different from other automatons in that they had the power to live. Puppets gained magical life from an elemental soul, which was usually an earth elemental. The process of creating a puppet would tie the soul to an artificial body. It would fuse with the specially prepared container and obey the will of the creator. Puppets had no intelligence. Unless the creator gave them an order, they would not do anything else. They would only listen to simple and clear orders and could not accept complex strategies or tactics. The creator of a puppet could give orders within 60 feet of the puppet and under the condition that the puppet could see and hear. If there was no order, the puppet would do its best to carry out the final order and fight back if it was attacked. When the creator left, he could give the puppet creature a simple command to manage its behavior, or he could make the puppet creature listen to another person's command. However, the creator could always command the puppet creature to only listen to him, thus taking back control. For some reason, as soon as he received the book, Grimm seemed to be engrossed in it. He flipped through the pages in one breath, unable to put it down. Puppet creatures were good stuff, not to mention the high-grade steel puppets. Even the lowest grade clay puppets had the basic challenge level of a senior apprentice. In other words, only a party of advanced combatants with the right combination of classes could defeat the clay golem. As a wizard's personal guard, puppets and runes were far more reliable and loyal than those hired with money. However, the price of puppets and runes was also staggering. Let's take the lowest level clay puppet as an example. A clay puppet without any witchcraft equipment would weigh up to 600 pounds, about 600 kilograms. When it stood up, it would be 8 feet tall and its entire body would be carved out of soft clay. This type of clay golem didn't fear the damage of sharp weapons. Only certain heavy weapons could inflict sufficient physical damage on it. This clay puppet's base price was 21,000 gold coins. As for the stone golem, which was slightly higher than the clay puppet, its base price was 55,000 gold coins. The steel golem, which was slightly higher, had a base price of 80,000 gold coins. This price did not even take into account the supply and demand of the market. In times of war, the price of these puppets, which were extremely suitable for killing on the battlefield, would not lack buyers even if their prices doubled. As long as a small lord could purchase 3 to 5 clay puppets and add them to his army, he would be able to gain a huge advantage in battles against the surrounding lords. Hence, if he could successfully become a puppet maker, then money would no longer be a problem for Grimm. It was a pity that creating puppets not only required a large amount of special materials, but also an extremely high level of crafting skills, as well as the ability to create soul weapons. If Grimm's innate elemental affinity was with the dark element, perhaps he could extract the souls of some humanoid creatures and easily create a soul weapon that could bestow a puppet with basic intelligence. However, he had an affinity with the fire element, so there was no way he could take this shortcut. Grimm could only ask the AI chip to temporarily store the contents of the Puppet Creature Creation Handbook for future research. Meanwhile, he began to research the new functions of the AI chip. As the incantation that was slow and full of magic rang out, Grimm's extended right hand lit up with a bright magical flame, wrapping his palm and a portion of his wrist within it. Watching the flame burn calmly in his hand, the AI chip's mechanical voice sounded in his mind. "Busy? A complete spiritual force model has been detected. Would host confirm whether to solidify it? Note, this will consume 2 points of spiritual force and 50 points of profession experience." The same notification had appeared when he was patrolling outside the tower. However, he was in a dangerous place at that time, so Grimm did not dare to experiment recklessly and chose to ignore it. However, today he wanted to see what this so-called solidification was all about. "Confirm," Grimm said. Beep. Solidification mission begins. Estimated time of completion, 12 hours, 27 minutes, 13 seconds. Following the AI chip's notification, Grimm's mind trembled. He could clearly feel that a portion of his spiritual force had disappeared for no reason. After checking his stats again, he found that the profession experience column on his personal data had dropped too. The 614 points of profession experience was all that Grimm had gained in the past 6 years. This included years and years of bitter meditation, countless failures in casting spells, countless times under the dim candlelight, copying obscure magic books, and the dangerous yet necessary magic experiments. It had to be said that Grimm in the past was a little useless. He had been an acolyte for 6 years, but he had only accumulated half of the required profession experience to become an intermediate acolyte. His only life-saving spell was the Burning Hand spell. As for the second spell he was learning, Flame Arrow, he had only just gathered the prerequisite knowledge and was still a long way from being able to successfully cast it. Based on the analysis of the data, his body's innate talent was considered low among the acolytes in the tower. It was no wonder that he had not become an intermediate acolyte after 6 years. However, this was the Grimm of the past. With the help of the AI chip, he had a new lease on life. All the difficulties in front of him could be overcome. Solidifying the Burning Hand's spiritual force model took up most of Grimm's attention, which made him feel a little tired. In this situation, it was no longer suitable for him to practice spells or read books that consumed his spiritual force. Thus, Grimm decided to lie on his bed and start a deep meditation. As he meditated, Grimm slowly calmed down. His breathing became slow and steady, and his consciousness was completely immersed in a strange world. The originally silent room became even more spacious and quiet, as if everything around him had suddenly quieted down. The feeling of his body became more and more blurry. It was as if he had fallen into a giant marshmallow, and everything that his body could sense was getting further and further away. Finally, his consciousness, which was no longer bound by his body, suddenly entered a strange world. It was a world of light. All sorts of colorful lights danced in the sky, filling up every inch of space that he could sense. Perhaps the intrusion of his spiritual consciousness had alarmed these erratic and mindless light spots. The entire strange world suddenly became somewhat different from before. Grimm's soul, which carried his consciousness, began to wander aimlessly in this world of lights. Wherever he went, the different spots of light seemed to have their own consciousness, displaying completely different behaviors and actions. Some of the red light spots seemed to welcome Grimm's arrival. All the red light spots that approached Grimm's consciousness rushed into his soul like birds returning to their nests, bringing him a bit of warmth. Some of the colder lights, such as blue, gray, black, and white, were obviously moving away from him. Some of the more neutral lights, such as purple, green, and khaki, did not reject or welcome them. Only when Grimm's consciousness touched them would they slowly merge with him. The whole process was peaceful, and there was nothing unnatural about it. Grimm's consciousness slowly wandered in the boundless sea of light, passively accepting the light spots to fuse with him. Out of curiosity, Grimm could not help but direct the light to approach some of the white lights. His arrival had undoubtedly caused the white lights to go berserk. The white lights that were drifting aimlessly just a moment ago were now scrambling to escape from this area. Grimm finally could not take it anymore. Under the strong guidance of his consciousness, the colorless and transparent soul suddenly stretched out an octopus-like spiritual tentacle and stabbed into a slightly larger white light. The white speck of light suddenly exploded and turned into a torrent of spiritual energy that flowed into Grimm's soul. Different from the warmth he felt when the red dot fused with him, the pale white that gave Grimm the feeling of coldness and deathly stillness. Chapter 12. Grimm shuddered and suddenly came out of his deep meditation. Suddenly sitting up on the bed, Grimm gasped for air. Everything in the dream was still vivid in his body. Even the traces of burning pain were still fresh in his memory. Was it an illusion, a dream, or something else? Grimm began to feel bewildered. In the past, he had meditated countless times, but every time it was a blur. It was rare for him to have such a clear and intuitive feeling. It was as if the dream he had just had was also under his control. AI, Chip, perform a new self-examination on me. Grimm seemed to have sensed something and ordered. Beep. Beginning body scan of host. Scan complete. Beginning self-examination report. With the AI, Chip's prompts, a new self-examination report appeared in his mind. Name, Grimm race, human attributes, strength 4, agility 4, vitality 3, spiritual force 8. 0-3 alignment, lawful neutral profession, apprentice elementary, HP. Profession experience state, healthy profession skills, scroll transcription, spell reading personal skills. Flaming hand as expected, there were some abnormal changes in his basic data. If not for the AI, Chip's precise monitoring, Grimm would not have known that the deep meditation gave him a 0.03 increase in spiritual force and 2 points of profession experience. This meant that the dreamlike scene just now was not an illusion, but something that had really happened and existed. Then what were those colorful spots of light? As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, the answer automatically appeared. Elemental particles. Every person with a magus innate talent would have different elemental affinities. The lights that he saw in his meditation were actually elemental particles that floated in the magus world. He had an affinity with the fire element. So those uninvited red lights were the so-called fire elemental particles. According to the classification of elemental particles, his affinity with the fire element was undoubtedly the highest, followed by the green plant element and the yellow earth element. As for the others, they had all been rejected by the elemental particles. As for the white light that Grimm was trying to capture in his meditation, it should be the so-called dark elemental particles. Due to the incompatibility between him and Grimm's origin, it would be 10 times or even 100 times more difficult for him to capture the dark elemental particles. Although the dark elemental particles that were incompatible with his body could slightly increase his spiritual power, they also damaged his body in disguise. As far as he could remember, the few apprentices in the Wizard Tower who mainly focused on dark element affinity were not in good health. They usually looked weak, probably because their bodies had been eroded by the dark element particles. It seemed that an acolyte's innate affinity attribute could affect the efficiency of each meditation, and the efficiency of each meditation could in turn increase the acolyte's spiritual force. Grimm recalled what he had seen and heard in the meditation space, and could not help but frown. According to his estimation, in the meditation space just now, the number of white light spots was obviously greater than the red fire elemental light spots. Didn't this mean that in such an environment, an acolyte with an affinity for the dark element would definitely have a higher meditation efficiency than him? Why was this happening? Shouldn't the elemental particles in the world be balanced? Could it be that this was deliberately done by the Wizard Tower? Grimm's expression suddenly turned ugly. He remembered that the master of the Wizard Tower, Wizard Anderson's innate affinity with the dark and wind elements were the most important. No wonder many acolytes who entered the Swan Tower at the same time as him had already grasped 2 or 3 spells and successfully advanced to intermediate acolytes, while he was still struggling on the path of a beginner acolyte. It was not only his innate talent that was dragging him down, but also this damned harsh environment. Grimm hesitated for a moment, but he did not try to meditate again. For a beginner acolyte like him, although meditation could slightly increase his spiritual force, it still could not replace sleep. Therefore, in order to recover his energy as quickly as possible, he had to let go of his worries and have a good sleep. Looking at his spiritual force that had been depleted by more than half, Grimm shook his head with a bitter smile and once again fell asleep on his bed. The next day, Grimm, who was still in deep sleep, was suddenly awakened by the AI chip's beep. At this moment, he was shocked to find that the AI chip's solidified Burning Hand's spiritual force model had been completed. Soon, all the data related to this spiritual force model flowed into Grimm's perception. Burning Hand was a low-grade fire spell that could both attack and defend. Its power was not that great, but there were still many runes that formed the spiritual force model. There were at least 28 of them. Each of these 28 runes had their own unique pronunciations and were almost independent of each other. They seemed to be unrelated to each other, but they could be combined to form a complete spell model. If such a task was given to an ordinary person, it would be impossible for most mortals to memorize 28 incantation syllables that were independent yet closely connected to each other, and then recite them in order without missing a single syllable. If Grimm had just arrived in this world, he would not have believed that he could do this. However, in this strange world that was filled with elemental energy, he was able to do it easily. Of course, this was also related to his high spiritual force of 8 points. In the past, if Grimm wanted to chant all 28 incantations in one breath, it would take him 5 to 7 seconds. However, after it was solidified, Grimm could save the time and only need to pour elemental energy into the Burning Hand that was already formed in his spiritual space. This meant that he only needed 2 to 3 seconds to cast a complete version of Burning Hand, greatly reducing the casting time. As his control over the fire elemental energy deepened, there was still room for him to shorten the casting time. There was more than one piece of good news. Since this was a spiritual force model that had been solidified in his mind, he did not need to exhaust his spiritual force to construct it bit by bit. Hence, this Burning Hand, which normally consumed 2 points of spiritual force, had now been reduced to 1 point. Did this not mean that the number of spells he could cast in the future had doubled? This was a discovery that made him wild with joy. However, the mighty AI chip's prompt sounded in his mind again. Beep. Discovered that there is room for improvement. Would host like to proceed? Note, This improvement will consume 1 point of spiritual force per day and require 100 profession EXP. Estimated time of completion is 34 hours and 25 minutes. Oh, improving Burning Hand? It sounded fine. But why would it consume so much profession EXP? If he had to consume profession EXP for every spiritual force model in the future, he was afraid that the little bit of profession EXP he had accumulated over the past 6 years would be squandered in the blink of an eye. Grimm did not let this surprise get to his head. Instead, he chose to reject it after thinking about it calmly. First of all, Burning Hand was only a close-range spell, and he was not satisfied with its battle value. Sooner or later, it would be replaced by a more valuable long-range attack or defensive spell, so there was not much point in continuing to invest in it. Secondly, with his current spiritual force, his spiritual space could not hold more than 3 solidified models. In this situation where there were too many monks and not enough gruel, leaving the limited spiritual space for Burning Hand was obviously not the best way to develop in the future. On the other hand, Grimm was more inclined to solidify long-range spells, and he even had a specific target in mind. That was another fire elemental spell that he had been studying for half a year, Flame Arrow. Flame Arrow was a low-grade fire elemental spell. It could condense fire elements into a magic arrow and shoot it at a target, dealing 7 points of physical damage and 18 points of fire elemental explosive damage. With Grimm's pitiful 3 points of vitality and 11 points of HP, a single flame arrow would be enough to kill him. That was why Grimm had always dreamed of obtaining a long-range attack spell. However, it was a pity that such a low-level spell like the Flame Arrow contained 34 spell runes. This caused him to bitterly study it for half a year, but he still could not grasp the method of constructing a spiritual force model. After such a long time, Grimm had spent no less than 20 knowledge points and a large amount of time on the Flame Arrow spell. Even his own witchcraft research had been delayed. However, he was still hovering at the threshold of success, unable to become an elite apprentice who could grasp multiple spells. However, with the help of the AI chip, the threshold should be much lower. Filled with excitement, Grimm did not care that it was breakfast time. He hurriedly washed his face and sat in front of the wooden table, flipping through his magic notes. All the spell models, incantations, mental strength oscillations, and casting materials related to the Flame Arrow had been recorded by Grimm in the book. A real spell casting was not as simple as ordinary people thought. The 34 syllables of the incantation were not something that could be recited in one breath to complete the spell casting. This process was an extremely complicated result of the perfect coordination of the hands, mouth, heart, and brain. When reciting each incantation, Grimm's spiritual force had to be adjusted to the frequency of the incantation, and his hands had to complete the necessary gestures. If there was any mistake or delay in the entire process, the only consequence would be a backlash. Chapter 13. 3 days later. The disheveled and red-eyed Grimm sighed as he closed his book. Just now, the long-awaited prompt from the AI chip rang out his mind. BZZZ, Flame Arrow's data model has been successfully constructed. It wasn't easy at all. Unlike the first time, Blazing Hand was a spell that Grimm had completely grasped. As long as he could cast it once, the AI chip would be able to accurately control the spiritual force and create a model of it in Grimm's spiritual world. Hence, everything seemed so easy and relaxed. However, Grimm hadn't truly grasped the Flame Arrow, and he couldn't even cast it once. Hence, the AI chip's imitation, recording, and storage functions were useless. Grimm had no choice but to take a different approach. He memorized the principles and casting techniques related to the Flame Arrow spell and passed them to the AI chip to sort out the data and analyze the most suitable way to cast a spell. The data model created through this method could not replace a real spiritual force model and was considered a special type of experiment. Grimm pinched his forehead and calmed himself down. He then said in a low voice, "Let's start the simulation." Asterisk beep. Asterisk with a crisp sound. A figure that looked exactly like him appeared in Grimm's mind. Following the requirements of the data model, he forcefully chanted the incantation for the flame arrow spell. Through the Chip's connection, Grimm's mind overlapped with the figures. As the incantation progressed, the frequency of his spiritual force constantly changed. The figure's hands danced lightly, guiding the gathered elemental energy to form a flaming arrow. Unfortunately, due to his lack of proficiency in casting the spell, the figure's hand movements lagged by half a beat when he chanted the 14th syllable of the incantation. In Grimm's spiritual world, the half-formed flame arrow suddenly exploded, and a violent shockwave of flames engulfed the figure in an instant. If this was the real world, Grimm wouldn't even be able to keep half of his room. However, in this illusory world created by his spiritual force, the figure shook violently, and the vivid explosion of flames disappeared without a trace. The entire scene returned to its original state. Although he knew that everything that happened here was virtual, the shadow controlled by Grimm could not help but wipe the cold sweat off his forehead. Grimm's heart skipped a beat as he watched a fireball explode in front of him and engulf his body in an instant. In order to let himself experience the complete process of casting a spell, Grimm had immersed his entire mind into the illusion. Therefore, you could say that everything that just happened was fake, or that a false reality had already happened. Grimm was not in a hurry to cast the spell again. Instead, he closed his eyes and analyzed the process in his mind again to determine the real cause of his mistake. Only then did he suddenly open his eyes and begin the second simulated spell casting. Unfortunately, he still failed. This time, it was the 17th syllable that failed. He didn't adjust the frequency of his mental power oscillations in time, and the mental power model that he had constructed exploded once again. The elemental flames engulfed Grimm's body once again. Light and shadow swayed as the scene rewound. Soon, the spiritual world returned to its original state. Grimm let out a bitter laugh and calmed himself down. Soon, his sonorous and forceful incantation resounded in the empty spiritual world once again. Boom, 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 endless explosions. The reason for every mistake was the same. It was either his hand gestures could not keep up with the syllables of the incantation, or his mental power was not in sync. In short, no matter which part of the process went wrong, there was only one result, and that was endless explosions. If this was the real world, Grimm's fragile body would have been blown to smithereens long ago. He would not be sitting in front of the wooden table in a daze like he was now. After so many times of practice, his limited spiritual power had long been squeezed out until not a drop was left. Whenever his mental power was completely exhausted, he would crawl to his bed and sleep. Once he woke up and replenished his mental power, he would go to the dining hall to eat and fill his stomach before returning to his residence for the next round of the simulation. Grimm clenched his teeth and finally succeeded in casting the flame arrow with his willpower and determination. When the silent elemental flames of the flame arrow condensed into a magic arrow and hovered steadily between Grimm's hands, he could not help but tear up. In the next second, the huge elemental flames engulfed him once again. However, this time, he was not dispirited. Instead, he laughed heartily before the spiritual illusion was destroyed. Grimm sat in front of the wooden table, his eyes suddenly opened, revealing an unconcealable joy. "AI Chip, have you saved the image?" "The image has been saved and can be used at any time." Grimm forced himself to calm down and nodded, but his clenched fists showed his excitement. The AI Chip's new function was a great help to him. Without the AI Chip's virtual world, Grimm could only go to the magic room and study the flame arrow spell again and again. Every time he failed, he would have to endure the backlash of his spirit and body. Every time he suffered a backlash, he would need to recuperate for a period of time. This would undoubtedly slow down his progress in learning spells. Therefore, among the apprentices in the tower, most of them had only mastered one or two witchcraft. That was the main reason why there were so few apprentices. Of course, there was also the possibility that some of the acolytes were hiding their true strength and had yet to display it. After all, every acolyte's research and progress were kept secret. It was a taboo for the wizard tower to pry into someone else's privacy. However, there were only a few who were scheming. Most of them were unlucky ones who struggled at the bottom of the acolytes. To be honest, Grimm was one of them in the past. However, with the activation of the AI chip, Grimm felt that it was time for him to soar into the sky. AI chip, send me the image of the success just now. Asterisk BZZ. Asterisk following the appearance of a stream of data, Grimm's mind once again projected the image of himself in the middle of casting a spell. Grimm's mind was immersed in the image, experiencing the process of casting the spell over and over again. Every detail, including the subtle changes in his mind at that time, was included without a single detail being left out. Although it was only a simulation of his spirit, Grimm's mind was completely following the normal process of casting the spell. Apart from the lack of real elemental energy, it was almost no different from casting a spell in the real world. Such a successful spell casting was extremely helpful to Grimm's mastery of witchcraft, and it went without saying. It could help Grimm save at least half a year to a year of painstaking work and avoid the inevitable cycle of getting injured, recovering, getting injured again, and then recovering again. Since he was able to succeed once or twice out of hundreds of attempts, it meant that Grimm's knowledge and strength were enough to support the casting of the flame arrow. The only thing stopping him from mastering the flame arrow was his proficiency in casting. This was the AI chip's strong suit. After revising it many times and making sure that he had grasped all the key points, Grimm hurriedly left his residence and went straight to the magic training room. This was also the inconvenience of being an acolyte. Their mastery of spells was too low, and the consequences of practicing a spell they were not familiar with in their own residence were too severe. Therefore, they could only spend money to rent a magic training room in the wizard tower to test their new spells. In other words, mastering a new spell required a large amount of knowledge and a large amount of money. The magic training room was located on the 3rd floor of the wizard tower. It was a special area. Although they were members of the wizard tower, the activity area that acolytes could set foot on was only between the 1st and 3rd floor. The 1st floor was the activity area for acolytes who had just joined the wizard tower. The 2nd floor was the living and entertainment area for formal acolytes, and the 3rd floor was the public area for their witchcraft experiments and practice. There was a library, a potion mixing room, a summoning room, an alchemy laboratory, a magic training room, a sealing room, a curse altar, a voodoo altar, and a potion cultivation room for formal acolytes. However, for a lone wolf like Grimm, the only places he frequented were the library and the magic training room. As for the other places, he did not have enough money to support him. It was dinner time, so there weren't many acolytes here. Grimm hurriedly paid 10 gold coins to AMU, who was in charge of the magic training room, and received a special card. With this card, he had an hour of practice time in the magic training room. For an apprentice sorcerer apprentice, an hour was not a short time. With their pitiful amount of spiritual force, they could not even support half an hour of crazy bombardment. If he used it without restraint, Grimm would run out of spiritual force in less than a quarter of an hour. Grimm followed the symbol on the card to the corresponding stone door. He raised the card and shook it lightly, and the heavy stone door opened silently. The so-called witchcraft training room was just a simple stone room of about 40 square meters. However, there was a huge stone human-shaped target at the other end of the room. The dark and heavy material indicated that it was made from the obsidian of the loathsome demon. With the strength of an acolyte, the low-level witchcraft experiments were not enough to destroy such a solid magic repellent statue. That was why it became the most durable target in the training room. Chapter 14. After the stone door was closed, the training room became an enclosed space. Grimm did not have to worry about being spied on anymore. Grimm took 2 steps forward and stood in a strange rune ring about 2 meters in diameter. He did not recognize any of the strange runes carved on it. It was obvious that this was beyond the knowledge of a wizard apprentice. However, he did not have the mood to spend time on these trivial details. He turned around and stood up, silently recalling the whole process of casting the flame arrow. After calming down, he ordered in a deep voice, "Monitor the whole process and correct any mistakes." Beep. New mission established. Beginning dynamic real-time monitoring. Following a flash of blue light in Grimm's eyes, a scene that looked like it was made of data was projected on his retina. The training room was still the same, but countless tiny blue nodes appeared on Grimm's retina, dividing the entire scene into countless small areas. The next movement that Grimm needed to complete was split into countless phantoms, and Grimm only needed to follow the phantoms to complete the movement. Finally, Grimm, who had been standing still for a long time, began to move. He loudly chanted a powerful incantation and quickly gestured with his hands in front of his chest. His movements were strange, but they had a strange charm that could captivate one's soul. As the incantation was completed, Grimm's body glowed red, and a large amount of fire elemental energy was summoned. The fire elemental energy slowly condensed into the shape of an arrow between his hands. Perhaps it was too smooth, but when he chanted the 30-second incantation, Grimm's mind trembled, and one of the nodes in his spiritual force model immediately collapsed. Under the chain reaction, the entire spiritual force model instantly collapsed. The violent fire elemental energy that had been repeatedly condensed and compressed suddenly went out of control. An earth-shattering fire elemental energy explosion was about to take place less than half a meter in front of Grimm. However, Grimm, who was already prepared for this, slammed the card in front of his chest the moment the elemental energy went out of control. As the card vibrated, the rune ring under Grimm's feet suddenly raised a witchcraft barrier, covering Grimm and the exploding flame arrow. Speaking of which, it was strange. The raging and chaotic fire elements were instantly reduced by more than half the moment they were enveloped by the magic barrier. Thus, what should have been an earth-shattering elemental explosion was suppressed into a small-scale fireworks display. After the muffled sound of firecrackers, thick black smoke and flames engulfed Grimm's figure. A moment later, Grimm rushed out while coughing violently. Damn it, I almost succeeded. His face was blackened by the thick smoke, and there were large areas of scorch marks on his clothes from being licked by the flames. His entire body was covered in soot, and he cut a sorry figure. Although he was at the center of the explosion, the activity of the violent fire elemental energy was suppressed by the spell formation. Hence, other than his hands and forehead being scorched by the flames, he did not suffer much damage. His first true casting failed. The reason for his failure was that Grimm's control over his emotions was too weak. Seeing that success was at hand, he could not suppress his excitement and allowed his emotions to interfere with the subsequent casting of the spell. Grimm summoned some wind elementals to blow away the thick smoke in the field. He tidied up his instruments and applied some ointment on his wounds before returning to the rune circle. Grimm gritted his teeth and did not hesitate to cast his second spell. Perhaps it was the heavens that rewarded him, or perhaps it was because the conditions were ripe. This time, his casting was especially smooth and carefree. After a long 13 seconds of casting, Grimm finally completed the flame arrow. When a violent fire elemental energy condensed into a flaming arrow in his palm, the sweet mechanical voice of the AI chips sounded in his mind. Beep. A complete spiritual force model has been detected. Would host confirm whether to solidify it? This process will cost 3 spiritual force and 50 profession EXP. I'm sure. Grimm couldn't wait to yell in agreement. Please name this spiritual force model. Flame arrow. Name successful. Beginning solidification mission. Estimated time taken: 14 hours, 37 minutes, 21 seconds. After dealing with the matters in his mind, Grimm still had to deal with the hot potato in his hands. Normal witchcraft would only have a delay of 2 to 3 seconds after the completion of the spell's casting. If the time was exceeded, or if the body was displaced, it would cause the spell to collapse. If the spell exploded in one's hands, the scene would be too beautiful. Hence, after Grimm processed the AI chip's prompts, he lightly pushed with his hands. The formed flame arrow shot towards the golem target at the other end of the room. The flame arrow exploded on the golem's chest. Without the spell formation to suppress it, the fire elemental energy finally revealed its violent side. It was a loud bang. A ball of fire the size of a human head suddenly appeared, spreading into a ferocious shockwave. The violent elemental flames instantly caused everything within a 5-meter radius to be engulfed in extreme heat. When the shockwave dissipated, the golem's chest was already charred black. There was even a fingernail-sized hole in the core of the explosion. A ripple appeared on the wall of the stone room, and a few lines of words appeared. Physical attack, 5 fire damage, 16-point spell attack range, 150-meter spell attack range. 5 meters, it had to be said that this kind of specialized training room was very cost-effective. With the help of the AI chip, Grimm did not need the fuzzy data from the spell formation. However, the other acolytes could not do without it. Only through the analysis and statistics of the spell formation would they be able to directly feel and control their spells. Otherwise, they could only experience it with fresh blood on the battlefield. In just a quarter of an hour, Grimm had achieved his goal and left the training room in satisfaction. When the stone door slowly opened in front of him, a beautiful figure waiting in front of the door entered his eyes. Slender limbs, a voluptuous figure, fair skin, and a delicate face. But what attracted Grimm the most was the fiery red dress and the fiery red lips. The only difference from before was that the ruby-like blood-red eyes had disappeared, replaced by a pair of aquamarine eyes that rippled like the ocean. Red Mary, good boy, you're here. Her bright red lips wriggled as she spat out a sentence that shocked Grimm to his core. All right, since I found him, you're useless now. Red Mary's second sentence was not directed at Grimm. It was only then that Grimm noticed that this not-so-tall female neighbor was dragging someone in her right hand. It was the person in charge of the training room, AMU. Red Mary waved her hand, and AMU was sent flying more than 10 meters away. He fell to the ground, moaning and groaning for a long time without getting up. Grimm's expression changed. Although AMU was not muscular, his weight was no less than that of an adult man's. This Mary had thrown him away so casually, and it looked like she did not use much strength. From this point alone, Grimm could tell that she had at least 10 points of strength. Judging from the nimbleness of her movements, it was clear that her agility was not low either. Coupled with her terrifying, blood-sucking regeneration ability, even the top 3 acolytes might not be able to deal with her. Wasn't she taken away by a wizard? How did she come back unscathed? Come with me. While Grimm was still thinking, Red Dress Mary had already grabbed his collar with her fair and tender right hand, turned around, and strode forward. Grimm wanted to dodge, but he really couldn't. Although Grimm was only 15 years old, he was already half a head taller than Red Mary. In order to avoid being dragged by the other party, he could only stagger behind her. He had no idea what was going on today. Public dining hall. It was dinner time, and most of the apprentices had gathered here. They sat in groups of 2s and 3s, chatting while eating. From where they sat and the way they talked, it was easy to tell how strong they were, as well as their status in the circle. After all, there were too few lone wolves like Grimm. Most apprentices preferred to form small groups to defend against competitors with bad intentions. However, just as the atmosphere in the hall was getting heated up, a loud bang sounded. The wooden door that had just been repaired was kicked open again. Chapter 15. After proudly announcing her return to the crowd, Mary stretched out her slender hand and grabbed Grimm in front of her. From today onwards, he is my subordinate. Anyone who dares to make things difficult for him will be my enemy. After saying this, Grim let go of her right hand and swept through the air. His extremely sharp claws left 5 faint scratches in the air. Only when the scratches slowly faded in the air did the sharp sound of wind breaking reach the crowd's ears. Ugh! What an abnormal agility, what a terrifying ability to break through attacks. With this kind of speed and attack power, who among the people present could complete the incantation before the attack reached their bodies? After estimating the power of Red Robe Mary's attack, everyone's faces turned ugly. Grim smiled bitterly and froze on the spot. For the first time, he felt a headache over his good luck. He had always believed in keeping a low profile, but in the end, he was undeniably involved in the storm of powerful apprentices. Even though this Red Robe Mary clearly had good intentions, could she really rely on simple intimidation of strength to suppress this group of fearless acolytes? In this wizard tower where people's hearts were unfathomable and scheming, there were too many ways to kill someone without anyone noticing. The library was full of curses, witchcraft, and poisons that could kill people without leaving a trace. As long as someone was willing to put in the effort, it was not difficult to let a student die without knowing why. In this sinister wizard tower, Grim did not want even a hair or a drop of blood to fall into the hands of outsiders. After all, there were all kinds of unimaginable and strange spells, and any carelessness could turn him into a puppet controlled by others. Therefore, most apprentices lived in seclusion. Even if they were companions in the same circle, they would rarely have any intimate contact. Feeling the faint hostile gazes from all directions, Grim once again smiled bitterly. This was a good way to attract hatred. In the past, he was just a harmless low-level apprentice in the eyes of others. Even if there was a small grudge, no one would try to kill him. But today, without even saying a word, he had offended almost all of the sorcerer apprentices. One could imagine that from now on, he would be an anomaly among the beginner apprentices. Anyone who tried to get close to him would either be trying to get information about this red shirt Mary, or dig a huge hole for him to die without knowing why. Although Grim cursed in his heart, he had no choice but to put on a poker face at this moment. After saying what she wanted to say, Red Dress Mary grabbed Grim and flew out of the restaurant. A moment later, the cold and arrogant Red Robe Mary appeared in front of Am, who was still in shock. "Give me the arena card." Mary, who had been reborn, displayed an unprecedented strength and tyranny. Her small hands slammed on the table, causing the things placed on the table to shake. An ugly and slimy frog crawled out of the pile of books and jumped onto Am's shoulder. It stared at Mary, the culprit, with its big, angry eyes. The frog was not big, but its head was surprisingly big. Its slippery back was full of lumps and blisters, and green juice could be seen in them. Its huge head was matched with a huge mouth, and its eyes were actually growing on 2 tentacle-like meaty pillars. It looked quite strange. AMU patted the frog's weird head in fear. He tilted his head and whispered something to the frog. The frog reluctantly opened its mouth and spat out a special card that was flashing with a golden luster. Mary snorted coldly, snatched the golden card, and dragged Grim away. Before they left, Grim could not help but look at the frog with a complicated expression. A companion beast. This frog should be the companion beast of the intermediate apprentice, Am. Apprentices like them who were still struggling at the bottom level of the tower were all trying to strengthen themselves, trying to increase their survival skills. Increasing one's spiritual force was undoubtedly the most difficult. Without the help of potions to increase one's spiritual force, top-level meditation techniques, and official wizards to answer their questions, they could only rely on themselves. Therefore, they were willing to try and fight for any method that could help them increase their strength. Companion beasts were undoubtedly one of the many ways to increase one's strength. Companion beasts were also known as parasitic beasts. They were special monsters that had been improved by witchcraft. Apprentices could use a special witchcraft ritual to establish a companion relationship between their soul and some kind of monster. Of course, this method had its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that they could indirectly use the monster's talent to give themselves some special abilities that others could not imagine. The disadvantage was that when establishing the companion relationship, part of the apprentice's soul had to be cut into the companion beast. This way, if the companion beast was seriously injured or died, the apprentice himself would also suffer. If it was light, his spiritual force would plummet and his soul would be injured. If it was heavy, his soul would be shattered and he would become an idiot. Ordinary apprentices could only establish a companion relationship with one kind of monster in their lifetime. However, there were always exceptions. One of the three powerhouses, Nefarious Worm, was obviously a life-bound beast. However, he had broken through the limit of life-bound beasts and hid a large number of strange worms in his body. As for how he did it, perhaps all the apprentices in the tower who wanted to take this path would want to know, but no one dared to pry into his secrets. This was because those who dared to do so all died mysteriously. AMU, who was only an intermediate apprentice, had chosen a poison dart frog as his life-bound beast, which could shoot poison arrows. Also, its regenerative ability was not bad. This was probably the main reason why AMU had chosen it. When the door of the stone room slowly closed, only Mary and Grimm were left in the huge arena. This arena was much bigger than the one before. It was at least 200 square meters. This was not a place for apprentices to practice witchcraft, but a small arena for duels. If there was any irreconcilable hatred between apprentices, they would usually come to this arena to fight it out. Although there was a rule that forbade taking someone's life, if there was a mistake, they would not have to pay with their life. All they had to do was pay a huge fine. This was why many apprentices were afraid of this arena and called it the Arena of Death. Mary's slender figure stood in front of Grimm, her delicate face carrying a cold smile that was a mixture of charm and cruelty. "I don't want useless people under me. Let's see what you've got today." After saying this, she let out a delicate yell. Without any preparation, her weak body swayed to the left and right, creating a series of shadows. Her real body was mixed in with the shadows as she charged at Grimm from the right at high speed. "Fight as you wish." This red-clothed Mary was too swift and decisive. Although Mary was a little cold in the past, she still had the cautiousness and low profile of a wizard apprentice. How come he had become so arrogant and domineering after a trip with Wizard Anderson? However, Grimm did not have time to think about this. Mary's attack had already arrived. A series of alarms rang in his mind and almost made him lose his mind. "Warning, warning. Target is approaching the host. Initial estimate. Agility greater than 13. Please move left 2 steps. Dodge and counterattack with Burning Hand." After all, the flame arrow had yet to solidify, so Grimm could only use the Burning Hand for now. The attack was so fast that Grimm's eyes could not even see where Mary was. He could only place all his hopes on the Chip's guidance. He stepped forward and quickly prepared his Burning Hand. But that was as far as he could go. Grimm tried his best to dodge, but he only managed to complete half of it before he stumbled and fell. The clothes below his ribs were torn, revealing 3 bloody marks. The Burning Hand in his hand swept across his body, but it did not even hit a ghost. Grimm pressed his hand on his wound and glared at Red Dress Mary in horror. She stood there leisurely, licking her fingernails that had traces of blood on them with her long and agile tongue. "Your reaction is quite fast. It's just that your body is a little weak. If this is all you can do, I'm afraid you're going to suffer a lot today." Perhaps it was because she had seen blood, but her eyes, which had already returned to their original state, began to glow red, looking dangerous and strange. "If you don't want to die, then hurry up." With that, Mary squatted down like a cheetah ready to pounce. Her aura suddenly became fierce and violent. "Damn it, I'm really going to die if this goes on." Seeing Mary's bloodshot eyes and the sharp canine teeth that were slowly protruding from her lips, Grimm's alarm grew louder and louder. Grimm didn't have time to deal with the wound on his right rib as he roared loudly. He clapped his hands heavily, and in less than 3 seconds of ultimate casting, both his palms ignited with bright red flames at the same time, protecting the front of his body tightly. "That's more like it." Hee hee, you better guard well. Mary laughed coldly and pounced forward like a bolt of lightning. With Grimm's dynamic vision, he could only follow the afterimages left behind by Red Dress Mary, but he could not find her real body. In order to avoid getting close to him like last time, Grimm moved his body in a small area, adjusting his posture while frantically waving his hands, using the blazing flames to seal off all possible routes of attack. Asterisk woo 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 star. Chapter 16. After fighting for so long, Grimm finally understood his weakness. His low physique was his biggest burden. Even with the help of the AI chip, he was still unable to unleash the full potential of his strength. His 4 points of agility covered his reaction speed, movement speed, and agility in controlling his body. Although the AI chip's dynamic vision captured Mary's movements in time, his overly stupid body could not translate the commands in his mind into the necessary movements. Hence, even though Grimm knew the direction and angle of his opponent's attack, he was always a step behind when he rushed to defend himself. Often, when his opponent's sharp claws brushed past his body, the flames would reach him, but he would not even be able to catch a glimpse of his opponent's clothes. Thus, in the huge arena, only 2 huge balls of scorching flames could be seen blocking left and right of Grimm, but he was still groaning miserably. As for Red Robe Mary, she was like an erratic red ghost, flashing around Grimm. Many times, the terrifying flames would brush past her delicate body as they moved, but they were still unable to do anything to her nimble and agile figure. Fortunately, Red Robe Mary was only testing Grimm's compatibility like it was a game. Every attack was only a superficial wound. Otherwise, Grimm would have been chopped into pieces and collapsed to the ground. Even so, Grimm's body was covered in claw marks from her sharp claws, and blood flowed profusely. Although the injuries on his body were not fatal, they made Grimm feel humiliated and resentful. A month ago, Mary was just a beginner acolyte who was not much stronger than him, but because of that damned witchcraft, she could now toy with him like a pet. Grimm suppressed the anger in his heart. Even though he knew he was no match for her, he still courageously controlled the flames to chase after the red figure. In the dark, Grimm's mind was still as calm as ice, and he was communicating with the AI chip without batting an eyelid. Since he could not see his opponent's movements, he could only use other methods. Grimm waved his hands with all his might. His mental power was quickly drained, and the terrifying flames attached to his hands became stronger and more turbulent. In the depths of his eyes, a strange blue flickered faintly, marking the interception point that the AI chip had vaguely calculated. When Grimm sensed that Red Robe Mary was right in front of him, he abruptly spread his hands apart, and a terrifying stream of flames instantly sealed off the left and right paths of attack, leaving a defensive gap of less than half a meter in front of him. Mary, who was about to dodge to Grimm's left, let out a cold snort. She stopped and straightened her body. With a slight sway of her body, she narrowly dodged the fiery stream of flames. Instead, she took advantage of the insignificant gap between her and Grimm's chest and abdomen. Humph, careless boy. Should I leave a mark on your face or on your chest? Mary, who still had the energy to spare, thought about it in a daze. For a moment, she was a little hesitant. Suddenly, her expression changed, and she retreated at an even faster speed. She was so fast that she did not even have the chance to teach Grimm a lesson. But even so, she retreated in time, but she still couldn't completely evade the 2 streams of flames that suddenly changed their direction. The 2 streams of terrifying flames collided in front of Grimm, exploding into sparks and creating a small sea of fire. Mary cried out in surprise and retreated 10 meters away. She could feel the slight pain on her body. She lowered her head to take a look and saw that her bright red gauze dress had already become a tattered one. The sparks that had burst out had burned out the holes, and the spring scenery inside was undoubtedly revealed. "You bastard! You actually dare to destroy my clothes." Mary's cold face suddenly froze, and her cold eyes stared straight at Grim, who was dancing with joy. It was rare for him to force Mary to retreat, and Grim was indescribably excited at this moment. He finally found a flaw in his opponent's fighting style. Against an assassin-type enemy with high agility, a concentrated witchcraft might be more lethal, but it could be easily dodged by the opponent. It was not as good as this kind of area of effect witchcraft that could restrict the opponent's space to dodge. Just as he was feeling proud of himself, he suddenly felt a surge of murderous intent. Grim looked up in shock, and only then did he see a ferocious young girl bearing her fangs and claws. Grim knew that something was wrong, and just as he was about to explain, a red shadow flashed in front of him. Mary had already pressed his head against the stone wall with one hand. The violent and ferocious impact caused Grim's limbs to tremble, and he even felt pain as his vision turned black and he fainted. And the moment he fainted, the last remaining consciousness in his mind was, what a fast speed. When Grim regained consciousness again, there was no part of his body that did not hurt. But what made him even more depressed was that he seemed to be being dragged away by someone. A cold little hand grabbed his ankle and dragged him to the ground, dragging him all the way back to his residence. His unprotected face was already covered in blood from the friction of the rough ground. Grim did not dare to struggle. After all, his previous actions seemed to have angered the temperamental Mary. Therefore, he could only continue to close his eyes and endure the pain that came from every part of his body. It was good that he could still feel pain. It was much better than being killed while unconscious. Grim secretly performed a self-examination, and the huge red warning on the projection was truly shocking. His maximum life force was only 11 points, and now it had fallen to 3 points. It could be said that he was on the edge of life and death. If it was any lower, he would probably enter a critically injured state. That damned red-robe Mary had not injured his vital parts. She had merely scratched him playfully, yet she had managed to weaken his life force to such an extent. From this, one could feel the huge difference in strength between the two. A moment later, Red-Robe Mary pushed open the wooden door of Grim's residence and threw him into the darkness of the house. Then a cold voice sounded, "Prepare yourself tonight. We will continue in 17 hours." It turned out that Mary had already noticed that he had woken up. Grim raised his head in horror, but all he saw was a half-opened wooden door and a slender and voluptuous body that was reflected by the candlelight in the corridor. 17 hours? Wasn't that the shortest amount of time he needed to recover? Grim opened his mouth to scream, but the wooden door had already been slammed shut, leaving him alone in the deep darkness. An hour later, Grim finally climbed up from the ground with a strong will and lit a candle. After taking off his tattered apprentice robe, his slightly thin body was covered in crisscrossed claw marks and wounds. Although it was not deep, it was unexpectedly dense. With the help of the dim candlelight, he began to carefully treat his wounded body. He definitely had basic healing ointments prepared. After all, while living in the tower, healing ointments and antidotes were indispensable. Enduring the pain, he grimaced in pain as he picked the ointment and smeared it on his wound. A numbing itch that almost made him go crazy came from the wound. However, after the numbing itch, there was a refreshing coolness and the sourness brought about by the rapid growth of his flesh. As a result, Grim slowly dealt with his injuries amidst the pain of crying and laughing. After treating his wounds, Grim finally had the time to focus on another part of the self-examination report. Attributes: Strength 4, 0-1, Agility 4, 0-4, Vitality 3, 0-2, Spirit 8, 0-7, Personal Skills. Burning Hand solidified. Flame Arrow solidified. Being trampled on by Ro just now had actually given him an overall increase in all his attributes. Even his Profession EXP had increased by 12 points. Grim could not help but let out a long sigh. Was this going to be his miserable life from now on? With grief and indignation, Grim laid on his bed and began his daily meditation. Once again, Grim arrived at the spiritual space formed by countless light spots. The ball of light in which Grimm's consciousness resided suddenly turned into a ferocious monster. It pulled out hundreds of tentacle-like spiritual threads from its body. Under Grimm's conscious control, these spiritual threads attacked in all directions, constantly waving around and absorbing the fire elements in the air at a speed that was 10 times faster than before. In his previous meditation sessions, Grimm could only passively absorb the fire elements. How could the efficiency be compared to now that he was actively attacking? With this efficiency, the effect of a meditation session would be more than 10 times stronger than before. Today had been a long day, and there were too many things that happened for him to take in. Only now did he have a chance to take a breather. As soon as he finished meditating, he did not even have the time to check the results of his meditation before he fell asleep. At dawn the next day, Grimm was once again awakened by a heavy knock on his door. "Who is it?" "It's me, Tony. It's time." Grimm grinned. Only then did he realize that it had been 6 days since the last patrol outside the tower. It was time for them to patrol again. He quickly glanced at the results of last night's meditation. His 15 spiritual force made him overjoyed. Just one night of meditation had increased his spiritual force by 0.08 points. Didn't this mean that even if he did not delve into any books on witchcraft, he could still rely on the most basic meditation to push his spiritual force to the level of a high-level acolyte within 3 months? Of course, there was more than one piece of good news. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.